We still have some folks who have been texting me, and yes, I do text. My students demanded it of me for a while. I held off. In fact, I actually had a flip phone up until last summer. And then when my wife Sheila and I went to Portland to visit our son, picked us up at the airport, and marched us directly to the nearest Verizon store and said, you will no longer have a flip phone because you need to get into the 21st century, right? So I do text. But the reason I say that, I don't know why I gave you that story, but we do have some folks that are kind of making their way back from Midtown. But in the interest of time, we're going to go ahead and get started. This session is titled The Making of the Institute of Black Culture at the University of Florida. And this is one of those panels and events that I really wish Joel Buchanan could have been around to see. He would have loved this. He would have loved the amazing diligence and passion and research that the student documentary team, led by Juliet Barbera, who's going to speak in a few minutes and introduce our commentator, Joel would have appreciated the tremendous energy and diligence and research that went into the making of this documentary and Institute of Black Culture. Juliet's going to talk a little bit about that. And then also, after that, we'll have a coffee break and book signing. And then when we come back, Juliet's going to talk a little bit more about the second documentary film, The Making of the Institute of Hispanic Latino Cultures, or La Casita, at UF. And so these are works, we've heard a lot about the importance of history and teaching young people history and making sure they don't forget it. But now we're flipping the script because it's younger people primarily who are teaching us the history, who felt so strongly about these two important institutions on campus that had been built and organized by students of color that they created documentaries. And I should also say that important for the documentaries, you know, they're rooted in the student movement of 2 summers ago to make sure that the Institute of Black Culture and La Casita were rebuilt in a manner that the students themselves find meaningful and important. Connected histories, but also distinctive, overlapping, but unique stories as well. And again, this is something that, because Joel was always talking to younger people about history, I think he would have been delighted to see what the students have been up to in terms of both proving the importance of these two institutions on campus, but not just talking about the history, connecting the history to the present and to the future. Juliet is also going to introduce our very distinguished visiting colleague, Professor Tamika Bradley-Hobbs from Valdosta State University, but she's asked to do that introduction herself. And so Professor Hobbs, I'm going to defer to her because she's the lead director, right? A couple more administrative things. After both the documentaries, so we'll have the Institute of Black Culture documentary screen first. We'll have a chance to hear Professor Tamika Bradley-Hobbs talk afterwards, her thoughts on the film. We'll do a coffee break, book signing. We'll come back to see the documentary La Casita, and then please don't leave because Professor Dr. Hazel Levy has been added to the program. She's doing an amazing project titled History Now, Black Women Researchers at UF College of Medicine, which starts at 5 p.m. It's a shorter presentation, but it's full of very important information about black women researchers at UF College of Medicine. So I'm going to cede the podium now to Julian.
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you for being here today. We are excited to premiere the film today on the making of the Institute of Black Culture. I want to make some brief comments before we begin. I want to recognize all the participants in this process that have allowed for this film to come together. There were a team of students, staff, and volunteers who have put work into this research and productions of these films. If you all can come up stage later, we'll have the panel session for Q&A for the student filmmakers. I would also like to thank those who have shared their oral histories and documents and those who have conducted oral histories. There were also students in the Black and Latinx course in spring 2018, as well as internship courses who have contributed to these archives, as well as many of past BOP alum who have recorded oral histories in years prior, of which we will be able to include in this film. And certainly, I would like to thank all those who have come before us and who are here today and continuing this work of the long freedom movement. In the spirit of the symposium, From Desegregation to Black Lives Matter, these films These films pose a question of where are we since the desegregation of the university into the present. I am proud to say that this was a film that was done through an ethnic studies lens. With that being said, I want to give a shout out to the African American Studies program for their 50th anniversary and doing what is necessary to continue Black studies. The Black Campus Movement challenged the structure of universities and society more broadly in their daily practices and Western political thought. These challenges continue today. The scholarship of Black studies and the experience and humanity of Black people, as well as other marginalized identities, are continuously debated not only in the classroom, but in all facets of social structures. The question this film poses is relevant as the pervasiveness of racism and intentional denial continues to harm us, not only in the classroom, but in every area of social life. Before we begin the film, I want to read a short passage from Dr. Ibram Kendi's book, The Black Campus Movement, and then I will introduce Dr. Hobbs, and then we'll start with the film. Malcolm X, the ideological father of the Black Campus Movement, once reasoned, "You don't stick a knife in a man's back 9 inches and then pull it out 6 inches and say you're making progress." The Black Campus Movement pulled out the knife several inches. The new ideals, the new racial construction gave higher education the tools to fully extract the knife and heal the wounds inflicted by 100 years of the moralized contraption, standardization of exclusion, normalized task of whiteness, and latter altruism. 40 years have passed since the demise of the Black Campus Movement. Has the knife been fully removed? Have the wounds healed? Has higher education racially advanced? Are we making progress? Most would agree that the new ideals put by the Black Campus Movement, exemplified now in one catchword, diversity, echoes from higher education. Almost every college and university in America has a public statement or mission on its website or in its literature declaring a commitment to diversity, a public commitment unheard of 50 years ago. There are signs that knives have been removed. Nonetheless, the debate lies in whether the statements are merely statements, ideals remain ideals, or whether they have been or are trying to be implemented. Whether colleges and university presidents are truly devoted to diversity or whether their public commitments simply satiate the political order of the day. There are without question new racial ideals, but some of those new ideals have been used to discriminate against African American and Chicanos, Latinos, Asian, Native Americans, women, LGBTs, and some whites. Over the last 40 years, ideals are rhetoric. The rhetorical tools that students forced onto the academy to pull out the knife have been used to keep it in higher education. The Black Campus Movement created new contradictions in the racial constitution of higher education. The use of new ideals supposedly to eliminate the old to maintain the old. So I would like to introduce Dr. Tamika Hobbs, who will be joining us after we present the film. Dr. Tamika Hobbs is a coordinator of African American Studies and associate professor of history. Dr. Hobbs has served as director of many public and oral history projects that affirm and celebrate African American culture and history, as well as an award-winning author. Her book, Democracy Abroad, Lynching at Home, Racial Violence in Florida, uses primary documents and oral testimonies to highlight the voices of African American witnesses and survivors of racial violence. Importantly, her work theorizes that the date that is often normalized as the lynching era between 1882 and 1930 is due to the perception that these incidents became sporadic and has to do with the dissonance between the democratic projection that the U.S. wants to promote after World War II. Despite continued violence and lack of civil rights that continue to be experienced by Black citizens, her work certainly informs us in the symposium From Desegregation to Black Lives Matter. Violence and deprivation of civil rights continues. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Hobbs. Someone get the lights.
but in all kinds of weather we really don't all stick together. When I'm at UF, I don't feel like I'm a Florida Gator, but when I leave UF, I feel like I'm a Gator. I think it's because not everybody here knows that the university has problematic roots, and that there's no actual acknowledgement of injustices on our campus, especially when it comes to the history of race.
When I would hear that song at the ball games, I pretty much ignored it. I wasn't the part of the old boys they were talking about.
Now here's what a lot of people don't know. They don't know that anybody went to University of Florida in the 30s, but I was one of them.
Sometimes the dominant narrative tells a story that begins with integration, as if that marked Black presence for the first time at the University of Florida. A history happened before that. If we are not knowledgeable, others can manufacture our knowledge for us.
I integrated the Taggart Hall office. There was no blacks working in offices. They were in custodial, if you know what I mean, and food service. Around the same time, Betty Stewart had been doing research on the testing that they require and the GPA that they required for admissions to the university, and the fact that African Americans could actually succeed with a C average, if that's all they had, in this school based on the kind of lifestyles they had had. And indeed, she was able to prove that, and that opened up the door to African Americans in this institution to test it.
UF desegregated in 1958, but there's a big difference between desegregation and integration. Now, I do think UF is a very diverse campus, but it's a matter of the whole idea of diversity versus inclusion. Do I think it's very inclusive? While there's a lot of progress, the University of Florida wasn't originally a space created for students of color.
The University of Florida, like many other predominantly white or historically white institutions in higher education, has a long history of excluding people of color from that institution. And when it essentially desegregated itself, all it did was desegregate itself. It did not integrate itself. So many of the black students at UF felt marginalized, alienated, undersupported, disrespected.
Well, when I came up in '69, that year, it was the largest class of black students. The only year that I lived on campus was my first year. They had one black student per floor. And naturally, I made friends with the janitorial staff.
I felt very welcomed by the students. In the classroom, on the other hand, the teachers, for the most part, were not that welcoming, appeared resentful that I was there, gave me a hard time. There were a few who recognized my ability and were not as offended by this so-called integration. But there were many who were.
All of my professors were white. Most were racist, treating me like I didn't belong, expecting us not to do well.
When I came for an interview in 1970, there were no black professors on the staff of the University of Florida. And they were on the court order to integrate the faculty and essentially to make a significant progress in terms of recruiting black minorities and whatever, stuff like that. And so, and they were monitoring them. So I knew very well that that was the situation.
I was told that the only reason I was at this school was because the university was trying to reach the quota.
As black students were finally being admitted to white universities, they were demanding that there be more black faculty and a curriculum that was more multicultural.
All history was basically white history, the history of Western civilization. and that if you were not a card-carrying member of Western civilization, then basically the culture that you represented had not done anything.
The Black Student Union was very much involved in protesting and doing the things that were necessary to make it possible for the program to be here. So the program was put in place in 1969, and they hired its first director in 1970, and that was Dr. Ronald Foreman. He was the director of the program for 30 years, but for the many years that he was dedicated to serving the program, he didn't get the resources that he needed, because I don't think anyone really, to some extent, people didn't want this program here. They didn't respect it, and they didn't really respect him.
So let everybody know that, the 1960s and 70s, there was a lot of student activism, and we all know that, but people tend to forget the activism of the 80s and 90s. Let's see, where do we begin? We created an organization called the Loyal Order of the 99. We were going to try to work in the community, on the campus, and throughout the state and throughout the country on this wide variety of issues that would, in a sense, change the template or the trajectory for 1999. There were housing incidents where students would be the victims of practical jokes. I remember one young woman had a bag of urine blown up in a balloon. She had that dropped on her head. We had the formation of white student unions sponsored by Klans, and we eventually got a white student union on campus that went around and promoted the notion that if you were a student of color, that you didn't deserve to be there because you were all affirmative action and unqualified, and you were taking jobs from qualified white men. We had a neo-Nazi movement moved across the street from the university adjacent to 7-Eleven or something at the time, and they would randomly attack students of color, and we went to the local police, and they, their notion was, well, we can't do anything until we actually catch somebody, and so we started forming community defense units to do that. One particular year, I remember a particular meeting with President Bryan. He was an interim president at the time, and we talked about the fact that we were facing this kind of unjust and we felt discriminatory structure when it came to funding and it came to supporting student activities. And President Bryan, I'll never forget, he says, "Well, I've never experienced discrimination in my lifetime, and I've been in Florida my whole life, and all of us, room full of people of color, I'm just kind of scared." It was almost surreal, because what in many ways it confirms that here you have the president of the university who's completely oblivious to issues that involve diverse communities, and so that means structures at the university that were supposed to be responsive were often not.
There just was a report that came out that UF's diversity index is like the bottom 10th of all public institutions. And when that report came out, I found it funny because the president sent out a thing praising that UF is in the top 10, it's a top 10, it's in the 8th, it's a top 10 university now and this and that. But you give no recognition or no acknowledgement of this school being in the bottom 10th of diversity in Florida.
We have been pushing for the African American Studies major for years, and we're getting the runaround. I don't know if a lot of people realize that. It was a program, it still is a program. When I came, they had a certificate in African American Studies only. That was in 2004. Then we got the minor, and then the major came out of protest. We did so many drafts of a proposal, and what would happen is that work on it, they submit it, it has to go to the college curriculum, it's past them, it's past the dean's office, then go to that, then the provost has to look at it, then it has to go back, and we kept getting for years. And then the blackface incident happened, and then they're going to push it through. But typically what we have happen at UF is something terrible happens, and so then a deal is cut, and then they pretend to be committed to diversity, and then something gets passed.
You would have situations where students, black students in a variety of majors at University of Florida could spend 4 or 5 or 6 years, however many years it is, and never have a black faculty member. So they weren't really receiving a narrative around black intellectualism, and in fact, they were receiving a message that intellectualism or intelligence resides in particular types of bodies.
And it's hard when you're the only one. So it's like you don't have anyone, you're just quiet. A lot of times you'll just sit there. I remember like having a psychology class my first semester. It was like developmental psychology. And we started talking about like how kids are raised differently and like based on race. So, you know, we're going to do like Hispanic, white, Asian, black. And then, I don't know, I just felt like it was very Eurocentric. Like, you know, black children are more loud and like, you know, they're a little bit more, I don't want to say like, he didn't say dangerous, but I mean, that's the way you're making it seem, like the way we're raised. We're very loud and physical. We'll have more anger. And it was just so like, oh my gosh, like this is what you're saying. I, of course, wouldn't say anything because I'm like, I am not saying nothing. But, you know, as soon as I left the class, I went and talked to my friends about it. So it's just like, I don't know, you're kind of just there taking in this Eurocentric lesson plan or like views of other students, and you're just like, well, what is going on here?
Let's go back to the storming of the president's office.
There was the students who were pushing it.
Black.
There was the students who were pushing everything. People from Shaw University, you know, who had come out of that meeting deciding to create SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and to push the sit-ins, the wait-ins, the ride-ins. And, you know, and we decided that at UF we had enough of a student population that we deserved to have a student organization, a Black Student Union.
The Black Student Union was already in existence, but it was very low-key. So me and several other people, we got together and we redid the Constitution of the BSU. We more or less modeled it after the Black Panthers. Instead of, you know, we had a chairman, had Minister of Defense, Minister of Information, that type of thing.
A seismic event the Black Student Union is known for is Black Thursday. Black students weren't happy with the experiences they had at UF, and Black Thursday is when these students came together to advocate for better black experiences.
And so we got together. A few of us, myself, Dr. Formoter, we got together with the students, and we said, look, we've done our best, they will not, you know. So we decided that they were going to march, okay? And that they were going to go to the president's office. We alerted the Minority Affairs Committee and the president that the students were going to come because they wanted to hear from him. No response. And the students did in fact go to Tigard with our support.
On April 15th, 1971, at 12:45 p.m., about 50 of us marched straight to President O'Connell's office with a list of demands.
1. Admit at least 500 black students out of the 2,800 freshman quota each year.
2. Establish a black cultural center.
3. Hire a black administrator in academic affairs and recruit black faculty.
4. Hire a black assistant manager in personnel.
5. Hire black faculty to reflect the ratio of black students.
6. Have fair and equal treatment of black brothers and sisters employed at UF.
We had a protest. We gave a set of demands to the administration. Then we had a sit-in in Stephen C. O'Connell's office. 60 or 70 of us got arrested. But in the end, that's how the Institute of Black Culture came into existence.
The Institute of Black Culture is a Black African cultural student center that has a long history at the University of Florida. Many of the Black students at UF felt marginalized, alienated, undersupported, disrespected, and they could find comfort, support, affirmation, validation in the Institute of Black Culture. It certainly wasn't the only resource on that campus, but it was a very important place for that community. A lot of the alumni had a very sort of strong connection to that space. It's the kind of thing that helps to retain students and make them feel like they belong in an institution that often is sending them messages both subtly and blatantly that they're not welcome.
For me, it was like, these places really matter, and I didn't even think about it until I was doing my research, and it's like, I always say, like, I felt like I grew up. You know, I became more comfortable with being Black as I stayed in the IBC, and this kind of gave me a reason, like, why, beyond, like, feelings and emotion, but, like, the whole negression theory of, like, how as Black people we develop our racial identity, which is something, you know, I'm thankful, like, being an African-American studies major, this is stuff we talked about. Like, it was very more, like, not so Eurocentric, but more of this worldview. Like, how do we develop as people rather than, like, this very American and white view? So that's something that I wanted to look at because I wanted to kind of connect it beyond, like, oh, it's a safe space, but more so, like, it's needed for our development as college students. You know, like, kind of we learned, they went through each stages, and, you know, like, when you learn you're Black, how you become comfortable, and then you kind of start to become an advocate. And it kind of acknowledges those feelings, too, of, like, at some point you also start to become, like, not depressed, but, like, you start to realize the reality of it. And that can sometimes bring on, like, this feeling of sadness of, like, how can you as a person change that? So it kind of gave me a reason, like, oh, this is why I felt the way I felt.
UF was actually one of the first schools to open a Black Cultural Center in 1972, which I thought was really, like, not what I expected at all.
Yeah, I think a lot of people don't realize that, like, and I didn't even realize that those two other schools and then UF were kind of like, I think the first I'd say, like, within the first 5. So I think a lot of people they don't get that. I'm like, this is, like, our cultural center is one of the first. Like, because the 1970s is, like, this wave of Black students entering PWIs, and then so now they want safe spaces. So you see this wave of, like, oh, cultural centers popping up. And the fact that we're one of the first is like, oh, my goodness, like, this is so cool. Like, this is, I don't know, like, kind of like a historic landmark, you know? But to them, like I said, I don't think they really care. Like, they're not concerned about that.
We had a Malcolm X university every year, and Afrocentric University, and so we would teach classes focused on African culture, African history, so focused on the Institute for Black Culture. We had a very close relationship with the Institute for Black Culture at the time, and, you know, that was kind of an operational base. We really, really saw that as our home, you know, and the home of the community and a safe place. We argued that it wasn't just a place to, you know, throw up some artwork and listen to some concerts or something like that. We made it an educational and political kind of headquarters. And, you know, there were those at the university who weren't very happy with that. Some people decided one night to go and basically spray paint the N-word and a bunch of other things, you know, go home and so forth. And they put it all over the Institute for Black Culture. Before the Morning Sun came up, the university had gotten this painting crew out, and they basically painted over it. And we responded by saying, okay, you can paint over it, but you can't deny it's there. And also, what are you going to do in terms of securing our facility? We wanted to teach the lesson that we as a community have to defend our facilities and stuff. We can't allow them to be attacked. We can't allow people to be attacked. We can't allow facilities to be attacked. And so, we put a 24-hour security detail around the IBC. And as a result of that, the university eventually added additional lighting in their own security because they didn't really want us out there. But we told them we would stay out there until you guys do something. And that's how we transformed the university. A lot of times they didn't want us to do it. They were like, oh, no, not those guys. So they would end up doing something they should have done in the first place because we're like, well, if you're not going to do it, we're going to do it. One of the big issues on campus right away was that, and maybe the issue that kind of catapulted us into a lot of involvement at the university, was the relationship between the student government at the time and student organizations. But the University of Florida, it was somewhat unique in that the student government was given a lot more autonomy. There was very much a hands-off approach. The student government was extremely unrepresented. It did not demographically, in terms of gender, race, class, any social variable you want to talk about, it was entirely unrepresented. You're getting this diverse student constituency, but you have a student government that only represents a few people. Like one of the rituals that used to really offend me was each year, organizations from people of color, whether it was the Black Student Union or whatever it was, would have to then go into a room with the budgeting bodies of the student government and try to convince them, that having money for Black History Month or having money for things that were relevant to their communities, whether that was worth, at least in their mind, student expense. And inevitably, that discussion is problematic. And when you're going in front of another group, trying to convince them of the importance of your own humanity, your own heritage, that's a problem. It led to a great deal of hostility between, diverse student communities and student government. It led to protests, and we were intimately involved in that. And finally, matters reached a head in one particular year. We developed a new leadership, and we said, we are going to protest as student government.
MCDA and I guess UF as a whole tried to get try to take students' temperature with regards to replacing the physical buildings that the institutes were held in. And that opened up a can of worms and started a storm. Where was it, baby? Where were the institutes going to move to?
The right?
Yeah, they were going to move the institutes to the right. Students were upset because they thought that they would basically just have, a couple rooms in the right, and these places that were not just felt like home because of people who spoke like them, who sound like them, who support them, but also physical homes with couches and TVs, a place to interact very much like, you would with your friends at home. They felt like that was being torn from them, and students were very upset. And I think there was talk of shutting stuff down and not allowing it. And I think for a long time, administrators wanted to move forward on the idea, but it was a non-starter with students, and they just didn't want to get into it with students.
And alumni.
And alumni. Alumni were not having it either. And of course, I think alumni probably had as much to do with it as current students at the time, because you don't want to alienate donors.
Everyone's favorite place has always been the house. So like for most of the older ambassadors, we love the house. It's where we studied. That's where we had events. It's where we took naps. It's where we had some of our deepest conversations. It's where we made connections with some of the people that mean a lot to us now, or mean the most to us on this campus now. It's definitely where I made a lot of my first and closest friends. So the transition is a little bit more difficult because the house was a little bit more fun, a little bit more relaxed, and we had less of an eye on us. So definitely being a group of minority students, we're in this space where there's glass everywhere, and we're right in the middle of campus and right in the middle of a student hub. So it's a little bit of a challenge because sometimes we feel kind of like a spectacle because people are peering in on us. Oh, we've never been in here before. Whereas at the house, it was kind of we were free to be ourselves and have certain conversations and not worry about anything else.
There was a push to try to get student government
to take over the funding of the of MCDA, actually. I think our budget probably came from the Dean of Students office or somewhere, and they thought that more resources would be available if we were funded through student government. And so there was a push to try to facilitate that. And I was in a staff meeting one day when one of our superiors, like superiors, came to the meeting and said, basically told us that our strategy would be to try to convince students to lobby on our behalf for funding from SGA by implying that if SGA did not fund the institutes, they would be shut down, and MCDA would be shut down.
So when we got word that they were going to tear it down, it was like, okay, but why? So they were saying, well, you know, it has a lot of problems. It has, you know, rats and this and that. And I was like, okay, but you, administration, let it get to that point. You know, you neglected it over the years. You were supposed to redo it 10 years after it was built or it was given to you. You know, so, you know, it was supposed to already receive renovations years and years and years ago. And they never did it. So then we got word that they were trying to, they also shut down the La Casita. Mm-hmm. So we got word that they were trying to combine it. Mm-hmm. And, you know, it's like, what?
It is July 12th. I am here with
Daniel Clayton.
Could you tell me what brings you here today?
What brings me here today is I am a part of a coalition of students, and we just go under hashtag, moniker, whatever you want to call it, No La Ibicita. So what that is, it's a combination of La Casita, which is the name for the Hispanic Latinx space on campus, and the IBC, the Institute of Black Culture, which is where Black students congregate, and also no, because we don't want a combination of these things to ever happen. We are communities, and we are able to appreciate how we interact with each other as fellow students of color because we have our own spaces that we can refer to whenever we feel oppressed, whenever we feel marginalized, but not even just when it comes to negative things. But we want to celebrate others, and we want to celebrate ourselves. Those are the spaces that we're there for. And these spaces are not being respected. They're not being honored. They're not honoring the promises that they made to the Black Thursday protesters back in 1971. They're not honoring the promises that were made to the Hispanic Latinx students back in 1994. And they are disrespecting the legacy of every single Black student and every single Hispanic Latinx student that has come through the University of Florida and that has ever walked through those doors, or even if they've never walked through those doors. Those spaces are there for us. They are for us, by us. And it is because of this that the University of Florida is able to put on all of their information. Look, we're not racist. We actually have people of color here. Yes, but the numbers are dwindling. With each incoming freshman class, there are less numbers of students of color. Pretty soon, we're not even sure what that's going to look like. And without spaces like these for us to be able to talk about events that occur on campus, such as earlier this year, there was a noose hanging in a classroom. And we didn't necessarily have that space to be able to talk about it. We don't feel we don't feel safe talking about this in regular university buildings. We don't know who's listening. We don't know what the repercussions are going to be.
The day before the sit-in, BSU met and we organized who was going to actually be in the president's office. I wasn't in office because at that time I was the Minister of Defense. I was more or less a marshal on the outside to make sure that everybody was where they were supposed to be. And then when UPD came, you know, nobody resisted or anything, and they had brought this bus, you know, to take us down to jail.
Some 67 of us were arrested or suspended for staging our sit-in. Our amnesty requests were denied, so we held a rally where several of us
submitted withdrawal slips in protest.
O'Connell was adamant that he wasn't going to create a black studies department. He wasn't going to set up an African American house or cultural facility. And any student that kept pushing that, he'd simply kicked from campus. It became clear that the university wasn't interested in entertaining a black cultural anything.
Over the next few days, black enrollment dropped significantly because more than 100 black students withdrew from the University of Florida.
Maybe it was from the dwindling of black enrollment or from all the protests, but as a coming together moment, O'Connell agreed to have an Institute of Black Culture, and that's how the IBC came to be.
The next academic year, he did everything we'd asked him to do, everything we had basically demanded, everything we had written down, including the creation of some of these spaces, and then claim credit for all of it.
So these institutions are so important, and in the early days, they often emerged as a result of student protests for these spaces to exist. That's true at San Francisco State, and it's true at the University of Florida. It's not the insight of university administrators knowing that they need to create these spaces for students. It's that they're a response to a demand because students are not being treated with respect or value at institutions where they attend.
I want to give thanks for the sacrifice that the alumni made to bring this building into position. And they did it out of necessity. And what's interesting is that they did it. They contributed towards something that most of them did not get the opportunity of having the privilege of being a part of.
There was a full sit-in, and people sat in the student government meeting. They also sat in at the student government office and refused to move. And so this was, the BAM movement completely, immobilized the student government that evening. And then, a smaller group of students decided that they would barricade themselves in the student government office and refuse to come out until the issue was addressed. And so this was the kind of the penultimate night. I remember getting a phone call from my home and coming over and seeing all the students who had, they all had signs and so forth that we don't want to be treated this way. And you had the students barricaded in the office who, basically would only talk to me, and said what their demands were. And it was very interesting. And then you had the student government officials refusing to do anything. Now, the university at first was going to come in with the SWAT team and, I guess, forcibly remove all these people. And I made the case that you don't want to do that. University of Florida is going to be on TV. The reaction from the community and places around is not going to be good for the image of the university. You do not want to bring the SWAT team against unarmed students expressing their political will. We need to engage in some serious negotiations here. We ended up with an agreement in which, student government realized that it probably would be a good idea to fund Black History Month, and that was the end of it. One of the most fascinating things was at the end of the demonstration, the university was going to, I assume they were going to move in and arrest the students who had barricaded themselves in the office. But interestingly enough, the power was cut to the building just at the moment the demonstration ended, and all of the students who were in the office were gone when the lights came back on. I thought that was a very interesting development. About 2 weeks later, one of the amusing things was the university asked me for my ID, and I gave them my ID. They were trying to prosecute me and some other people for allegedly coordinating all of this, but what it really was, students had had enough. Many of the organizations that were created on campuses for students of color and so forth and so on are kind of created in this beggar position where they see their role as kind of begging the administrative structure for money and resources on behalf of their constituencies. And that leads to a leadership that is inclined to beg. They're not inclined direct action, to protest, to sit-ins, to, these are people who basically are like, well, I guess we got to ask them. Well, they said no. Let's ask them again. Let's ask them again. I am totally hostile to that kind of leadership.
The other thing I want to give thanks to is for those directors such as V and all those directors that have come since the inception of the IBC. Because in all their own way, they invested nights, days, years of blood, sweat, tears, because it was something that they believed in, and it was students that they believed in, and it was a cause that they believed in.
The fate of the houses belonging to the Institute of Black Culture and Institute of Hispanic Affairs is still up in the air, but today, members of the two communities made sure university officials know exactly where they stand.
More than 100 members of the Hispanic and Black community at the University of Florida chanted, "The community united will not be beaten." They marched through the campus speaking out against the new design, a proposal that would join the IBC and La Casita buildings. The group stormed into an ongoing multicultural and diversity affairs board meeting, demanding the two cultural buildings remain separate.
We are here because we have tried every other way that we possibly know how to get the attention of the administration and MCDA to hear our voices, and we felt like we have not been heard. And so today is a protest for our voices to be amplified and for our voices to be heard by the people who need to hear them.
Although the meeting was adjourned minutes after, the floor was open for discussion and opinions.
Daniela Garrido, WUFT News.
We need more people like that, and I wish that their peers and the university had appreciated them in a different way, because what they are asking for is space. Space for people that look like them, that's needed in a place that's not for them in the same way that they need it, So that was a wonderful, beautiful thing to watch.
The IBC is just as much a part of UF history as anything else that's going on this campus. But the IBC must continue to grow to be greater than the space that is going to be allocated on this campus. It has to reflect the place that it has in all of our hearts, in all of our souls, in all of our minds. It has to grow larger than the space, because while we will have a new building in a couple of years, guess what? In another 40-some years, that building's going to be old too. We have to always give thanks. We have to always reflect on where we come from, but we have to always keep it in perspective of what we're doing and where we are going. And most importantly, I want to say thanks to all of you. Because without the legacy being pushed forward and being carried forward, then there is no IBC, there is no story.
Testing 1, 2. Okay, we're live. Another round of applause, please, for this wonderful, thought-provoking documentary, The Making of the IBC. Just congratulations to Juliet and the entire team. Show of hands from everyone that was a part of the team to put that together. Yes. Tremendous work, powerful storytelling. I will jump right into my comments. 50 years after the rise of the Black student movement and 47 years after the founding of the University of Florida's Institute of Black Culture, this is the first of a two-part series, The Making of the IBC. The second one that we'll watch a little bit later deals with the Institute on Hispanic Latino Culture. But the pair of them offer an opportunity to take a moment to look back, to analyze, and to reflect as the campus prepares for a new physical space and a new phase of the IBC's history. The saga of the Institute of Black Culture at the University of Florida is a part of what scholar Ibram Kendi has called the long Black student movement in the United States. While the history of Black students seeking inclusion at predominantly white institutions stretches back to the antebellum period, this later phase occurred in the years after the U.S. Supreme Court decision in Brown versus Board of Education. In the decades after the case, the trickle of Black students on white campuses became a steady flow both around the nation and here at the University of Florida. In 1962, the University of Florida admitted its first Black undergraduate students as a part of a wave of integration at historically white colleges and universities across the country on a much larger scale than had existed before. As Fabio Rojas describes in his work From Black Power to Black Studies, Black students in the 1960s were situated at the nexus of a kinetic mix of rampant social changes. First, school integration. Second, dissatisfaction and disappointment with the limits of change wrought by the mainstream civil rights movement. And third, a concomitant attraction to the radicalism of the burgeoning Black Power movement. Out of this energy, the first Black student unions and Black studies programs were founded at San Francisco State College in 1966 and 1969, respectively. It was around the time that the Black studies program here at the University of Florida was also founded. Coming in age in this era, Black students at UF were prepared to engage with the white administration not as victims who would suffer in silence, but as empowered, agentic people who were clear about their value and their rights, and exhibiting a willingness to forcefully assert their demands for inclusion. This culminated with the confrontation that we've been watching on April 15th, 1971, known as Black Thursday. There are many similar threads that connect the Black student struggle since 1971, and this documentary follows them over the course of 5 decades. This work is reminiscent of another documentary, Agents of Change, produced by Frank Dawson and Abby Ginsberg. It was released in 2016, and the film tells the story of the first protest at San Francisco State College and Cornell University in 1968 and 1969 that led to the creations of these first Black Studies programs. That documentary and the one we watch today are similar in that they tell origin stories. However, the story of the IBC resonates as an ongoing and unresolved in many ways saga on the continuing struggle for inclusion on campuses like these. In discussing the history and function of Black cultural centers, researcher Lori Patton pinpoints that they are, quote, rooted in a struggle for students to hold institutions of higher education accountable. They made a host of demands to ensure that their experiences would be represented and supported in the cultural, academic, and social context of the university, end quote. Addressing the spiritual and psychic wear and tear that is often a part of the daily existence of people of color at PWIs, Charles R. Lawrence III wrote about the importance of what he called home places. He described them as, quote, safe places among trusted friends to seek refuge and dress wounds of battle, and places for hard conversations where differences can be aired and strategy mapped, where we can struggle and affirm one another. The reflections of both Patton and Lawrence point to a pair of important and dueling realities at the core of cultural centers, then and now, involving the complementary needs of both representation and respite for students of color attending historically and predominantly white colleges and universities. Ideally, spaces like the IBC are a signal, a physical representation to the larger community and to the campus community that blackness is valued here. It exists here comfortably and is welcome here. These structures stand as symbols of inclusion and respect. Simultaneously, however, the IBC has operated as the safe space Lawrence alluded to, a place of rest and reaffirmation for those battling, sometimes daily, against macro and microaggressions and invalidations in many forms. It is where students can cultivate a sense of home and community. The circumstances surrounding the original creation, the deconstruction and reconstruction of the IBC and La Casita represent the continuing struggle of UF and other PWIs with the recruitment, inclusion, and retention of students of color, a struggle that takes place on many levels. Examined systemically, it must be acknowledged that the commitment to diversity in Florida's public colleges and universities has been inconsistent over the past 30 years. We have to remember the role of the One Florida Initiative, an executive order signed in November of 1999 by then Governor Jeb Bush that ended affirmative action policies in college admissions. Since its implementation, the numbers of black students on the campuses of Florida's public universities has declined from 18% to 13%. More recently, UF experienced a decline in black student enrollment, dropping from 9% in 2011 to 6% in 2013. It remained, the last numbers I was able to find for the 2017-2018 year, at 6%. Now, remember, we started back in 1971 with the black student representation as less than 2%. It's still at 6%. That gives you a rough average of less than 1% increase over 5 decades. Those numbers speak for themselves. All right, that's my professor from undergrad, so I'm doing good. Okay. According to the 2018 report by the USC's Race and Equity Center on Black students at public colleges and universities, the University of Florida received decent remarks on racial equity and completion and in proportion of black faculty, but earned a failing grade for representational equity, ranking fourth on the list of at least ranking fourth on the list of the least diverse campuses in Florida. Those numbers speak for themselves. This pair of documentaries and the conversations and reflections they will spark are extremely important for several reasons. First and foremost, using the collections of what is now the Joel Buchanan African American Oral History Collection, they have done the vitally important work of documenting and recording the thoughts and recollections of the actors who helped to create the IBC, as well as those who have been instrumental in its operation over the years since its founding. More importantly, perhaps, in the spirit of Sankofa, these documentaries are instructive as this campus prepares to open the new IBC, providing an opportunity to look back and recapture the passion and vision of the original founders. Their struggles and successes should be compasses that guide the current and future directions of the IBC. In closing, I'd like to leave you with a few observations and considerations about the future of the IBC and the Institute's program here at the University of Florida. First, as I watched this documentary, it was readily apparent that some of the same frustrations and dissatisfaction that exist among the current generations of black students at UF sound nearly identical as those from 1971. While the campus now has thriving African American Studies program and is working to decolonize the curriculum, the day-to-day experiences of isolation seem to remain. This, in my mind, proves the point that the Institute of Black Cultures here at US is as vital and necessary as ever. Beyond that, as the IBC reopens, it is a good time to consider new directions for operations and programs that will meet the needs of this century. As you consider the demographic realities of our modern world, how has and how will the IBC embrace the diversity of the African diaspora and bring into the fold students from Africa, the Caribbean, Latin America, and Europe? How has and how will the IBC support the continued growth of the African American Studies program as it expands into a department? How can the leadership and membership of the IBC ensure that the value of Africana Studies is institutionalized through the core curriculum and through student advisement? How can the IBC support the need for the recruitment and retention of faculty of African descent? How will the IBC address the issue of intersectionality, especially around the issues of gender equity and sexual orientation? How has and how will the IBC promote and integrate the values of social justice and community service, both of which were the core components of the DNA of the original Black Studies programs when they were founded? Lastly, as the IBC prioritizes the need to create a home place for students of color, could or should it perhaps begin to address the disease of white supremacy writ large in global society, encouraging dialogues around whiteness and anti-racism, which would illuminate the foundational issues that had bred racial friction in this country from 1619 to 2019? Could this kind of programming help to identify and deconstruct the issues of whiteness and the ethos of white supremacy? Can we flip the discussion away from the focus on cultural centers as other places and instead apply and expand what Cheryl Harris has named as the property of whiteness, and finally language the reality of PWI campuses as white racialized spaces? Could such conversations inspire the commitment of the broader university, including the administration, trustees, donors, board members, and alumni, to give voice to active anti-racism as an institutional value? With that, I conclude my comments. At this point, we'll bring up the producers of the film for a Q&A.
I think we're out of time for Q&A, but I'll be here and a lot of us will be here, so I don't know if we want to continue with the Q&A or Dr. Ortiz. Yeah, I wasn't sure if you want to continue with the Q&A.
I'm glad there were some issues.
Okay, so we'll do a 10-minute Q&A, but feel free to come in and out. So all students who are involved in the documentaries project in any capacity, please feel free to come up here as well.
I just bought 2 books. One's by Paul Ortiz, African American and the Latinic History, and also Emancipation Betrayed. My question to the panel is as follows. As we move towards further in the 21st century, when the issue no longer is black-white racism, but also deals with the cultural aspects of America, what do you as a panel recommend? What do you recommend, not just University of Florida, but all our universities, Florida A&M, for example? One of the things I talked to Dr. Rivers, who's here from FAMU, that we need to make sure that next year at a similar program like this, you would discuss Jonathan C. Gibbs, who, just as you indicated, after the Civil War, there was Reconstruction that needs to be carried on, and that still has not carried out, that involves everybody, not just blacks, not just whites, but also the Latino. What do you think?
So in like the 60s and 70s, we had this conflict between what is desegregation and what is integration. And you know there's a big difference between the two. And now we're seeing this shift in what is diversity and what is inclusion. Because when you think of diversity, you think of numbers, you know, but when you think of inclusion, you think space, that these people feel like they're a part of something. And in that sense, the structures have changed outwardly, but they haven't changed inwardly. And if we keep just letting it happen and think that diversity is inclusion, then nothing's really going to change. Nothing's going to get better. So I think the best way to move on towards inclusivity is to acknowledge these historical injustices. Because before working with the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program and before working on this documentary, I had no idea of Black Thursday, the IBC, the Black Student Union. And I feel like a lot of people here didn't know about the history of UF. And I think by acknowledging these injustices, we can learn from our mistakes and we can progress towards inclusivity.
To go off of what Adrian was saying, when I went through preview, IBC and La Casita were not a part of that tour. I promise you, and they're not now. And I think an issue that we have also that gets, I was talking to somebody yesterday about this. They were asking why we were even showing a La Casita documentary at an African American oral history program or symposium. And it's simply the fact that Latinos are black too, and they're as much a part of the diaspora as everyone else. And a big problem that we have at this university and in the United States at large is that we try to put people of color into these boxes of what a black person looks like, and this is what they sound like, and this is what a successful black person or Latino looks like and sounds like. And it's when we do that we fail to acknowledge the value of all the different ways that there are to exist as a person of color. And we fail to serve those communities and the individuality of each person. And we hope to highlight that. We hope that we highlighted that in the next documentary and in this one as well.
I'm going to piggyback off of what Adrian said about diversity and inclusivity. I feel like one of the newer waves of the structure changing on the outside is multiculturalism. Same with how they wanted to make the houses one thing, saying that, well, since you're all people of color, like regardless of the fact that you have different cultural roots and different cultural practices, you should all just have one house. Like, I feel like, especially in PWIs, people mistake that version of inclusivity with integration, and it's not. You can appreciate cultures when you embrace yours, and you can teach more to other cultures when you have a space to embrace yours. So I feel like, at least starting with the University of Florida, like getting the houses back is like a baby step, but I feel like, just like Adrian said and just like Aaliyah said, promoting the real tea, like the really what actually happens at University of Florida. I know myself personally, like I've been through AASU, HSA, I'm Latina myself, and BSU, and all the spaces are kind of different, they operate differently, and MCDA is cool, but it still operates very separately. Like I feel like there's not that homey space to really be yourself and to really let loose. Rights is made of glass. Like, you know, you don't want to feel watched when you have like personal things to talk about. Or when I was speaking to Oliver about it when IBC was here, they were having meetings when Philando Castillo was happening, when DACA was getting taken away. People were having meetings there. It's supposed to be a safe space. So I feel like pushing forward, there needs to be more space for students to feel comfortable, and there needs to be more faculty that are willing to represent and like aid students. Considering the fact that especially black student admission has been going down, black faculty are at a disadvantage to speak up because that's their job. I know it's different for a student to be able to rally and go to protests. They're not putting their home, their mortgages or anything on the line. Exactly. No. And it's more or less like having that support system, having somebody that looks like you, and having more faculty that can relate to you and embrace your culture and know exactly what you're going through, because they probably went through that 40 years ago, considering we just watched a documentary that showed the same systemic oppression. So I personally feel like a lot of space hasn't been taken too much into accountability. And I feel like the university has done its best to gloss over its historical roots. So I feel like another thing is just education. Same thing here. I didn't know about Black Thursday. I'm a senior now. I transferred from BC 3 years ago. And I feel like just this is a campus full of thousands of students that don't even know or choose to willingly ignore it. But that's their character. I can't speak on that. But I feel like the University of Florida owes it to its students, owes it to our minority students, especially students of color, that narrative, because they need to know what they're signing up for. Preview, for example, I think when I got here, the 2 houses were up, and I didn't get to see that. My dad went here in the 80s, and he didn't even really know that it was a thing. They don't really promote the things that can aid students of color. So I feel like, sorry, I'm getting choked, but I feel like when we put to the forefront what has been missing and what has been like lacking in the access to space, access to resources, especially with given budget cuts, affirmative action being on for 20 years, it's crazy. So I feel like lack of education and lack of space has been detrimental to it, and I feel like given the fact that we're almost into the second decade in the 21st century, like it's about time.
So I just wanted to touch upon how like the University of Florida is a microcosm of a macrocosm, and sorry, I wanted to acknowledge how the University of Florida is a microcosm of a macrocosm, and in order to make change, I think we all need to constantly challenge ourselves. We need to listen to stories, and I want to say that working at the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program has been very transformative for me, because I'm so thankful for like hearing these stories of such brave Black activists, you know, putting their lives on the line, putting their academics on the line for something that they know to be true in their heart and that they deserve. And I think each and every one of us need to open up sort of that listening space. It seems like we're in a very quick world where we just kind of like nod heads, like, okay, how are you doing? But we don't truly listen. And stories are really the most powerful things that we have. And we need to utilize that. We need to challenge our own perspectives and incorporate each and every story into how we interact with the world around us. So I think, you know, life is uncomfortable. Every day should be uncomfortable if we want to make a change. So that's what I've learned.
Just want to say thank you guys so much for the documentary that you guys created. It's pretty powerful. My name is Xavier Williams. I'm a fourth-year medical student here at the university. I learned a ton in just those 30, 40 minutes. And my journey here started in 2009. I got my undergraduate degree, graduated 2013, then came back from medical school. One of the things that I wanted to ask, this needs to get out to the graduate programs. Just as much as there's the underrepresentation within the main campus for the undergraduate program, I mean, that underrepresentation is even more marked within the graduate programs. I came across this just by going on Facebook and just kind of finding something. There was an advertisement, and I'm so glad that I found it. But just understanding that a lot of you all will likely go on to either go into careers or even go into graduate programs, and by having the current grad students know about these things, we can offer mentorship. One of the biggest things I think is so important is when you take the elevator to the top, you have to send it back down, and that elevator is for you all to continue to do what you do. So I guess my question, one, I'm really thankful for your passion, but how can we include the graduate programs to be a part of these discussions and a part of these projects? Because it's incredible. I want to share this at the medical school, but I just want to know maybe your thoughts on that. And my second question, it's very brief. Antonio Farias, the UF Chief Diversity Officer, does he know about this? because he should be here. When we talk about, he is here? Okay, well, yes, I mean, when we talk about inclusion and we're talking about this, this individual who's going to help push and he's passionate about increasing diversity at the university, we're moving from top 8 towards top 5. And as we move into these ranks, we're going to unfortunately see more representation of other minority groups suffer. It's going to dwindle, and we don't want that to happen. So I just ask because he should be a part of this discussion too.
We have less than a minute left, but we'll consider your question and take Dr. Fullwood's question.
I don't really have a question as well. I just wanted to congratulate you and thank you for the documentary. I've gone full circle with the documentary because I'm a native Gainesvillian who grew up here and attended Bethune-Cookman after graduation, but then transferred back here to the University of Florida. And when I came back, it was sort of like Albert White going to Greensboro. After I got back here after a year is when the protests started. I was one of the students who did withdraw from and protested and withdrew from the university, so I lost the semester. I did come back to finish up degrees here and went on to work here for 35 years, and 33 of those years I was the advisor for the Black Student Union. So all of the events that were depicted here, I'm pretty much aware of them from 1970 on. And I know that we have made some progress. But I can't help but say that after I retired in 2010, that the percentage of African American students declined. I don't know if I had anything to do with that. But I do see some progress, and I'm very pleased with the progress that I've seen between African American students and Latino students, because that coalition is what has the two buildings going up across the street. Without that coalition, you would probably be stuffed over in the rights union. So I'm congratulate you on that union, and that may continue to be a strong bond, because I think that's what's going to make things move forward.
So we're out of time, but if you wanted to stay and discuss, we can discuss. But also, Dr. Simmons made a point that we haven't introduced ourselves, so if the panel wants to go by and introduce ourselves. My name is Juliet Barbera. I'm a doctoral student here at University of Florida.
Hi, I'm Bianca Ramirez, and I'm a fourth-year student at the University of Florida.
I'm Chris Torres. I'm a fourth-year student at the University of Florida.
I'm Aaliyah Miranda. I'm a fifth-year student at the University of Florida.
And I'm Adrian Martinez, and I'm a third-year student at the University of Florida.
Thank you, everyone.
Let's give another round of applause to our student filmmakers, directors, and researchers. Wonderful. The program says we reconvene at 4. We have another film coming up, so we have time for a short break. So let's go ahead and take the break, and can we come back at 4:05 and start at 4:05 sharp? Okay, all right, let's do it. Ready? Break. All right, good afternoon. We're going to, I'm going to ask you to start finding your way back to your seats so we can start our next student-produced documentary. And just a few announcements at the outset. I'm going to pass around a sign-up sheet. We've been talking and hearing about the importance of storytelling. If you would like to tell your story to the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program, or you know of someone that wants to tell their story, please pass this around, and we'll get one going in one direction and one going in the other direction, because we're all about storytelling and outreaching and connecting to people. Let's start with another round of applause for our student filmmakers. It's just incredibly inspiring to watch this first wonderful student documentary. And a couple of administrative things, if you just joined us, remember after this session, we'll have one more session. Dr. Hazel Levy, who's in the house, is going to give us a wonderful presentation titled History Now, Black Women Researchers at the UF College of Medicine. So please do not leave after this session. And I also want to acknowledge two dear friends of the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program that have just arrived. And they come from a long distance, and they're going to be on an electrifying panel tomorrow titled Legacies of Lynching, the Odyssey of Oscar Mack in Florida and Beyond. And I want to acknowledge the great-grandchildren of Oscar Mack, Mr. James Brown and Ms. Vanessa Bonner, who've just joined us. Thank you. So now we're going to transition to a student documentary titled The Making of the Institute of Hispanic Latino Cultures, La Casita at UF. We're also privileged to have as a commentator Professor Nicholas Vargas, who is at the University of Florida, a dear colleague, a wonderful scholar at the Center for Latin American Studies, Political Science, who is with us. Let's give him a round of applause for joining us today. And I think Juliet will have more of a formal introduction for you, Nick. He's shaking his head. We got to do it. Maximum respect, right? Just a few words about the student documentaries and the wonderful history and storytelling in them. These are made possible by student activism, the student movement that was organized by students here in the summer of 2017. And as the students began to talk between each other, they realized the importance of digging deeper into their own peers' histories in previous student movements. And then the second part of that was, of course, coming up with resources to do the films. We were approached at the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program, what can we do? How can we document? How can we present to the administration, to the faculty, to our fellow students, the importance of these two precious places that we've struggled for and that we feel the responsibility to continue building on the work of our ancestors in struggle. I normally don't have a big wallet, okay? So I didn't have the resources to be able to say, hey, here's the resources to put the film together. So we went to Provost Joe Glover, and I talked with him, had a very extensive discussion. We talked about the importance of using research and analysis and writing and video production and using those to tell these stories. And I want to tell you that Provost Glover was forthcoming and actually gave us the resources that we needed to do these productions. And again, that's a testament. I'm not doing this, by the way, to get in good with Provost Glover, if he's watching, and he might well be watching, right? I'm telling you this, again, to remind us where the momentum originally comes from. That momentum to create ethnic studies at the universities, at the colleges in this country in the 50s and 60s came from where originally? From students, okay? And then faculty kind of join in, the administration joins in. If we work together, we can make it happen. And this is what is being on display this afternoon. So now I'm going to call Juliet again, and she's going to take over the podium.
So So thank you again for attending this session. Thank you for being here today. We're excited to premiere the film today on the making of the Institute of Hispanic and Latino Cultures. I have some brief comments I want to share before we start. I want to recognize all participants in this process that allowed for the film to come together. There are a team of students, staff, and volunteers who put work into this research and productions of these films. If you are here, please join us as well when we have the panel session. I also want to say that I want to say thank you to all those who shared their oral histories with us and documents, and those who have conducted oral histories. There are students in the Black and Latinx course who have contributed to these archives as well, and many past BOP alumni who have recorded oral histories years prior, which we were able to include in this film as well. During the founding of La Casita, there was a recognition listed by the students' demands for a need for Latino studies. In 2019, the formal establishment of Latino studies has not been introduced at the University of Florida. During the 20th year anniversary of La Casita, there was an effort to collect oral histories to preserve the legacy of the houses, and some of those interviews are used in this film as well, from the Nuestra Historias collection, meaning our histories. I want to also mention that great work was done by SPOP alumni in producing the La Casita documentary that preceded this a few years ago. If one thing is clear in the symposium is that the work of others who came before us has allowed us to do the work that we're doing in the present time. On that note, I would like to highlight some things that in my observation are often neglected when discussing La Casita, which is the connection it has to the IBC and the longer history of campus and social movements. La Casita, although made possible by the work of those in the Hispanic and Latinx community, it was also importantly made possible because of the efforts of African Americans who conceptualized the establishment of Black cultural centers in the first place, and the struggle that they face in entering institutions of which they are excluded and in many ways continue to be. It has also been an observation that often those who are in closer proximity to whiteness have often compromised the legacy of cultural centers. There are many scholars, particularly scholars of color, who have written on the threat, there have been particularly Black scholars that have written on the threat of Black cultural centers, the threats that they face, and all cultural centers face for that matter. In the age of diversity, multiculturalism, and inclusion, numerous scholars of color have written about how these ideologies threaten culturally specific legacies to make culture more palatable to whiteness via Western-centric modes of understanding culture as something to be performed or homogenized. There is no connection highlighting the power structure that create identities or that keep power structures in place of which continue marginalization. There was an independent report done by the former La Casita director, Maria Masque. She used her skills in her profession as an urban planner and found that indeed the IBC and the Institute of Hispanic and Latino Cultures did not have to be demolished. They were actually salvageable and eligible for historical preservation, yet decisions were made to demolish them. Revisiting the point I made earlier, the Western-centric views of what cultural centers or cultural in general will always be under threat if they are not understood appropriately in the context of their own histories and narratives. The unnecessary destruction of the houses was not merely a building they took down, but an act of white supremacy, not to mention the ways in which students and staff who represent those communities were treated in that process, or the years of having to occupy an unsafe building. This report should be on your flash drives if you have them, but we also have copies. I brought two here if you want to pass it around. There's a place that has a blue post-it, has the conclusions the report found, but if you would like a full copy, please feel free to let us know and we'll provide that for you. I also want to introduce Dr. Nicholas Vargas. Dr. Vargas is an assistant professor in the Center of Latin American Studies and in the Department of Sociology, Criminology, and Law, and coordinates the Latino and Latina Studies specialization for the Masters in Latin American Studies program. His research examines how the social construction of race and religion are measured in research, shaped by social networks, and acts as stratification in higher education among U.S. Latina and Latinas. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Vargas after this film. So we're setting it up now.
There was a lot of working knowledge, but there was nothing institutionalized about the history that I knew of. Depending upon who you spoke to, the people at Latin American Studies gave me some from a faculty perspective, what they were part of and what those trees symbolized in the Plaza de Americas and their historical role with La Casita. I heard from the Student Affairs Administration, their history of La Casita. And then as I met alumni from La Casita, I started to hear, other histories. And these histories kind of competed with each other. There was never really a working history of La Casita, one that coalesced everything that I heard. And so a part of it was because, well, that's the reason why I think we started to do Nuestras Historias, because that was something we needed. Like, why don't we have a clear history that's told for us, by, for, and about us? We have histories being told about us from other people. So I said, and I'm not an oral historian, but I knew we needed to start somewhere. Even if it was a documentary that just became sort of like a footnote of something much bigger. The fact that footnote meant that we had a foothold in history now. That meant that this Nuestras Historias meant that we had something greater to say that UF was just starting to listen to. But I knew that if I were just to continue to take the pen from their hand and write the story that they wanted to, we would be nowhere. So, I took it to my community, I took it to our students, we took it to the streets, and we said to ourselves, we're writing this narrative for ourselves. So, regardless of what they have said about us, regardless of what these competing narratives were about, we were going to focus on a narrative that placed us at the center of the discourse, one that honored our voices. And even those of us that came in for a short period of time, like myself, for 3 years I was there, even my voice needed to be honored and recognized, as well as all of our generations of ancestors that gave us the opportunity to sit at La Casa.
Todavía había un remanente de la vieja era del sur. Remember the past, so we can put the creation of La Casita in perspective. I came here in 1980, and this university, until a few years before that, was an all-white male institution. So a student was a man, and he was white. Obviously, the law changed that.
Even though I was a faculty member from 1993 to 2000, I was also a master's student from 1984 to 1987. So I came at a time when the place was, I wouldn't say hostile, it was just not very welcoming. But people laughed at me when I spoke and I mispronounced words. And this is not that long ago. Yeah. I eventually just shut up. I didn't speak because when I spoke, people laughed. And it wasn't a very welcome environment. You felt like an odd person. And when you spoke, everybody looked at you, and where are you from, or what are you?
There were still some traces of the past. So Hispanic students had to come and accommodate themselves to that established style. And many of them didn't feel welcome or feel at home in a big institution like this with that kind of a past.
I was in Katrina, who became the director of the Institute of Black Cultures, and I sat down with community members from Tucson and Cuandayá and a number of people, and we realized that we needed to talk about racism. And that was a major issue in both of our communities. In those days, we had the emergence of the White Student Union, the Ku Klux Klan all over town. In 1992, Gainesville celebrated Hitler's birthday in the downtown plaza. So there was a lot of hate crime out and inside the university too. So we had to deal with all of those things. It was really a charged time with a lot of very similar to what we're seeing today.
Actually, I was going to say,
very similar to what we're seeing. It's almost like deja vu.
I know that one of the newer ambassadors came in one day and said that somebody in his residence hall screamed at him to speak English because he was talking to his mom on the phone in Spanish. And I think he was a freshman. Yeah, he was in the dorms. Yeah, he was a freshman before he moved out. He came into the house and told us that story, and we're like, what the heck? Like, that's not okay, blah, 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 right? So
it just kind of depends on the right place. Like if you're in the wrong place at the wrong time, you're gonna hear something crazy.
There was no talk about the reality of Latinos in Florida at all, or at the University of Florida. So the experience of Latinos at the time was totally ignored. The fact that the university had over 2,000 Latino, almost 3,000 Latino students. There was not a support structure for Latinos. They were not even, formally recognized as minorities within the support structure to minority groups in the Latino community. So what we had was this divide in terms of Black and white population. But the Latino population was not part of the conversation issues that were talked about or the policies of the university for that matter. And that's when we decided that we needed to bring that to the table and also make alliances with other minority groups as well. So what we decided after this workshop that was called, I don't recall when or where, was that there was a lot of divisions amongst the Latinos, and we were pretty much fighting each other rather than building relationships. No? So we decided out of that to create a Hispanic Latino Student Council. And one of the proposals of the Hispanic Latino Student Council had to do with the need to create the Institute of Hispanic Latino Workers. So it became a banner. I recall that the relationship with the university administration was a little bit tense at the time as well because of the lack of recognition of the importance of inserting these issues in the university policy agenda. That they were doing enough with having a check, minority students, whatever office, and dealing with Black issues, and that was enough. I recall we had very difficult conversations within the student body and student body governance and the way they looked at Latinos. So when we were trying to create Latinos en Acción, it was an issue because they already had a Hispanic Student Association. And again, it's this issue of, oh, you have one, that's enough, shut up. So no recognition of diversity of positions or the fact that Latinos was a very large group within the U.S. student body at the time.
What was my blessing and my privilege was to meet someone like Livia Noemi Rodriguez, who to me was the number one person, student-driven force behind the Institute. And I think that she needs to be recognized that while this was a joint effort of so many people sitting here and some that cannot be here, but she, to me, stood above the crowd. Her energy, her intellect, her abilities were superb. And she helped us. I was just the person to decide kind of little advocacy and advising and guidance, but the driving force between her peers to make that happen.
Oh, this was not an easy process. We faced a lot of hurdles with the university administration, even with the president of the university, with the student affairs director, who was this white male. I don't recall his name, but he was at all not sympathetic to what Latino students were saying at the time. So it came to a point in which we had to recur to people outside of UF for support, not only the Latino community in Florida, in other places in Florida, but also we reached out to national organizations such as La Raza, the National Council of La Raza, who intervene in the process on behalf of the Latino students. I recall petitions and so forth. Fortunately enough, we didn't have to do sit-ins because we were able to get this before it got to that. I guess that the pressure that we started placing from other places in the U.S. was also important to get the institute finally established. And I guess that other than that, the fact that the Hispanic Latino Student Council and Latinos en Acción started to organize and reach out to Latino students in the southeastern region of the United States to make a conference of Latino students that were facing similar issues in their campuses, to organize as, in a wider, beyond Florida or beyond way.
When Dr. Lombardi became the president of University of Florida in March of 1990, I was not here at the time, Dr. Fagundo was, but within history has shown us, because there is a quality of life task force report that indicated that he was able to put together a group of people from the Afro-American community and from the Hispanic community, and out of that, for the first time, beyond the conversations of the students and the needs expressed, became tangible in black and white in a report, the need for an institute.
Those services that are provided for all of the other students were not available to us. And we paid the same tuition that all of the other students. And the community, our community has crisis as well, has wonderful things going on. So aside from being administrator and being programmer and being all of the different things that you do with the students, you also have to take roles that you're not even trained for, or may have some training related to it, but it's not really what you do. And take the risk that, well, I can lose my job for doing this, but what do I rather lose, my job or a life, or my love, my job or somebody's future, and so you have to make those decisions.
On the moment.
On the moment, and there's no chance to, so I don't want anybody to take it like, oh, we're in crisis all the time, but I think it's very relevant that back in those days, the counseling center and the counseling profession in general, not just here, had a very wide model of how to treat any kind of emergency, and didn't satisfy the needs of African American, Hispanic Latinos, or all kinds of different students. You understand? So that's what I'm trying to convey.
La Casita, it was an initiative to get a space where not only that Latin students from Latin American descent could feel, that they had a place to go where they can manifest their culture freely, without having anyone, criticize them for speaking Spanish, which is something that I did experience, being in groups and talking Spanish amongst yourselves, and then people would actually, point back to you like you're in America, you're supposed to be speaking in English, for example. So that sorts of comments we used to get all the time. So we thought that we needed a space where we could express ourselves, not only in terms of culturally, but also a place where we could start, have the opportunity to learn about what the explore what the Latino experience and its diversity was like, what the Latino issues in Florida and the States were like, and have the opportunity to get engaged on those issues from an activist position.
It's not just about, oh, let's have a cultural center, like you said. It is.
Talks and activities.
Yeah, and the talks and activities. There are more things that are really important for Hispanic, Latino students, Chicanos, however, Puerto Ricans, Cubanos, Nicaraguenses, things that affect us, things that some of us are separated from our families, some of us are refugees that are here in the United States, growing up away from families in our countries in Central America or in Venezuela or wherever you are, and that the needs are going to be very different than your average folk. And you sometimes are paying double tuition, but you're getting a quarter of the services back. So it's about equality. It's not about asking for extras. It's about asking for the same that everyone gets.
During my freshman year, we were advocating for in-state tuition for undocumented students. At that time, we were trying to gather all of the students at that time to go rally to Tallahassee. And at that point, in-state tuition did not exist for DACA or undocumented students. So it wasn't a thing in Florida. And I remember that was when I got my first sense of like what advocacy or what being a student activist felt like. At that point, we all met at La Casita to just learn more about the issues. And I think that's the first idea, or that's where I got my first sense of like, this is what I really like. I like advocating for students who feel that they need a voice, not only on campus, but they also need a voice in the state of Florida. So I think that advocating for in-state tuition was one of those issues that kind of just opened the gate to other issues that were also predominant here at the university during that time.
So at the time, I mean, Florida had the third most important library of Latin America. It had the Center for Latin American Studies, but again, the focus of the center was to do research regarding Latin American countries. Nobody was looking or talking about the Latino experience within the U.S., even though Florida had 13% of its population at the time from Latino descent. It was, I guess, the fourth largest state with Latino population at the time, but at the University of Florida, which is a public university, those issues were not discussed, not taught, not dissected, and we felt that there was a void there. So one of the reasons, not only it had to do with attracting and making sure that there was a retention of Latino students, that they could have a place to hang out and just, be themselves and discuss the issues that they were facing at the time, but also a place where to organize around the issues that were affecting Latino students at the time and the wider Latino community. And already before that, there was an organization that was called something like Spanish America Legal Students as a SALSA. I guess they did it for the acronym, but not paying attention of what the word Spanish American means, or which is one of the issues that was discussed at the time amongst Latino students was, why are we calling ourselves Hispanic, which means of Spanish descent, rather than recognizing that we come from countries that were colonized, where indigenous peoples were massacred. So that's one of the points of the argument, was precisely why do we have to call ourselves Hispanics, which is the name that has been imposed to this segment of the population and does not speak to the diversity of the Latino population.
About my Latin students, Hispanic students at Florida, when we talked about racism that was going on, nosotros no son racistas. We're not racist, but we all get along no matter what color skin. And I was like, okay, let's talk about that. Let's talk about our country. Who is at the top and who's at the bottom? Yes, majority are white at the top. And who's at the bottom? Indigenous, Africanos, Talk about racism. Yeah, we have racism in our country. Just don't talk about it, but it's there. So I always push safety with my students to educate them, to make them think differently, to think outside the box, Because in our countries, we don't really talk about it. But it is happening, and it's constantly happening. And look at the language we use as well. And I go, So, and then, during Puerto Rican week, we also did Latinx Heritage Month, Latino Heritage Month. We did Hispanic Heritage Month, let's call that Florida, because here we call it Latino Heritage Month. But at Florida, Hispanic Heritage Month, we did doing on Latinas and being Black and Latina.
Okay.
So we would have conversations about what it's like to be, Afro-Latina or Afro-Latino, and the dual discrimination, right? From both sides, right? So it was important to have those type of dialogues and share them with one another. Yes, social justice is key. We're a group that's being oppressed in the society. Therefore, social justice. So what we did is we worked with the Immokalee workers. They came to our office. Nobody wanted to help them, but we did. Why not? Immokalee workers, first off, I had to teach my MASA organization, Mexican American Student Association, to learn how to say Chicano. Because they're like, Chicano? No, Chicano. Chicano? No, Chicano. Okay? These are Mexican American kids. They're from Florida. Never heard the word Chicano in their life. Okay? And I said, these are our workers working in the tomato industry who are being abused in the field for 1 penny more per pound. Taco Bell, Kentucky Fried Chicken, Pizza Hut, okay, are abusing the workers in the field, not getting the justified work that they deserve for working in hot sun trying to get tomatoes. So I got the students involved. We got the workers to talk about their experience so my students would be educated about what's happening. And we worked with the monthly worker organization, and we did a protest right there on the main street right there where La Casita was at, right? And there was a Taco Bell like 6 blocks away from there. And we did a big protest right there at that Taco Bell. And I told the students, it's your decision. I never forced any student to do something they did not want to do. But I made sure that they knew what it's the history, what was going on, what are the policies, what are the issues. And I say, it's up to you. I'm not going to get mad at you. I'm not going to go against you because I understand we all come from different places. And I also understand for some of you and your families, like my family, are afraid to do protests or do walks because of death or someone's going to attack you or something bad's going to happen. It's your decision. But I'll let you know I will be out there and I will have the monthly workers stay the night in La Casita so we can do a protest about workers' justice, rights, and the importance of, understanding what's happening. Talked about others today and how we need to support one another. So we had really positive dialogue about it, and those that were uncomfortable, we said, that's okay, but let people be who they want to be, let them be who they want to be. And so we were in the process with La Casita working with the Dean of Students to start the Pride Center too.
When I had the opportunity to work over at La Casita as director, I wanted to, of course, continue the legacy of La Casita being a home away from home for our students and promoting programming and leadership and activism. And so we did a lot of things at La Casita, as I'm sure they do now. And I had fantastic students that I got to work with over at La Casita, and that are doing fantastic things right now. Instances in the history of La Casita that we would often discuss around racism and issues like that. I think that, one of the issues that we had to deal with sometimes was
Estudiantes Puertorriqueños Activos, the Puerto Rican students, they had their Puerto Rican week and somebody spray painted all over it, no Puerto Rican. On the big, on that main street where everybody has a freedom of speech wall that goes on? There, that happened there. To save affirmative action. Because Jeb Bush did it as an executive order. An executive order, are you kidding me? Do people in Florida even have a right to vote on it or have any, And then the following year, see, without affirmative action, we were able to increase our diversity. That's because I knew the director of admission who would try to get as many students of color he could before it was eliminated. So therefore, the numbers went up. I know the background story.
Years ago, as I stated before, after the event happened, news of the incident was featured on the front page of the Alligator. Another event involving a fraternity and an Asian-themed party prompted students to band together and form what would be known as the Voices Against Racism March. Students marched from the Rights Union over to La Casita, showcasing a banner that stated that they were voicing their opposition against racism.
At that point, I'm worried too about safety. You don't know what's going to happen. I mean, if somebody's willing to defame university property, with that. I think the FBI investigated, and I had spoken with them to see if I knew of anybody maybe who could have been involved or whatever. And Dean Sina was the dean of students at that time, and I just wanted to make sure that first that we were going to be safe to do this. But then I thought, when you step into leadership, like high visibility leadership roles, those are the things that can happen. And then at that point you decide, well, do I keep on running? And risk something happening to me, or do I, step down, even if it's the day before the election,
And the speakers were focused on issues that, it wasn't specifically addressing Latinx identities, but there was some of that, but a lot of the time they were addressing issues that affected Latinos in the U.S., Latinos at this institution, Latin America, it was counselors, it was attorneys, it was, job coaches, career, all kinds of stuff. It was just a speaker series. And it was really cool. And even though we were graduate students, we would like run into other people. We would talk to the undergrads who were there. And so you definitely felt that it was a place that not only fostered community, but like fostered a family environment. And that's what it felt like. It felt like Los Primos, you know, like you're gonna kind of come around and like, I may like some more than others, and I may have more affinity with some than others, but whatever, but you're going to talk to everybody, and then you would run into people and you would be like, hey, what's up?
Minority fits more what that meant, like folks who were still really on the fringe, versus how do we celebrate culture, how do we educate all students around a range of identities is really the forming, coming together of multicultural and diversity affairs. And then with that, having, as the rights union expansion and renovation was done, having spaces in there, real visible.
So that was one thing. The next thing was that I remember, I must have been my second year or maybe my third year, somewhere in there, where there was a push to try to get student government to take over the funding of the institute, of MCDA actually. It seems to me now in hindsight that, so there's limited resources for these students, but this is what we have. We have directors of these institutes, we have these graduate students, whatever. And we know that these people can influence these students. And so we're going to use the people who are closest to these students, right, to plant the seed of, fear and, what's it called, like distress, just to put them in a position where they feel like they have to fight for the little that they already have. And you're going to use the people who deal with them on a daily basis to pass that message. It's maniacal, you know? And I distinctly remember Natalia and Anthony pushing back against saying that this was not an appropriate approach. When I first started there in 2007, they had just done like some painting and replaced the carpets and just small, cosmetic things. But we knew that I think the house had termites, and there was a bathroom that didn't work. What else? I don't know. I feel like there were some structural things that needed to be addressed, and they had looked over the 4 years I was there. We talked about it several times, but I feel like the institution did not want to invest in the houses because they wanted to go multicultural route as opposed to a population-specific route, and so I guess that's where they drew inspiration for their policies. So there was a time when we were talking about connecting the two, like building a bridge from one to the other on the second floor, and it just all kinds of the ideas we were brainstorming to try to figure out how to make the spaces work. I feel like the institution was wanting to move towards multiculturalism, so a multicultural center for everybody, I guess, for all the marginalized groups.
Individual spaces for the different groups, which on its face does not sound terrible, but you have to consider that what you were doing is you were taking people who had a place to call their own and saying, well, now you share with everyone else. And it still doesn't seem like, from some perspectives, it might not seem that bad. You're saying, well, the university is for everyone, and then these are spaces for marginalized communities or minority communities. So you should be happy with that because there's nothing like that for the majority community. But that's not accurate because all of the university is for the majority community. It's a predominantly white institution, and it's been that way for a long time there.
A lack of, it's almost like upper administration didn't get it. They were completely detached from the everyday experiences of the students who really needed these spaces. So they're thinking about it from a big picture perspective,
right? The institutes are old and they need to whatever, and they need to be taken, they need to be fixed. But, you know, when you take that space away, what does it leave for students who feel like this is all that they have? This is the place where it feels like home. This is the place where is where they can come and meet with people who understand their struggles and meet with administrators who are willing to take the time to sit with them and talk about whatever, whether it's school or personal or, there's so much work that was done out of those institutes by the directors, by the graduate students, by the ambassadors. So much work was done, and I feel like, it was necessary work. It was needed by the communities that we served, and the spaces were physical embodiments of that. And to take those away, I mean, I cannot believe that the spaces are, they've been demolished, right? And again, this is, how many, this is a lot of mercy, 10 years later. I have the benefit of hindsight, and I have, a lot more professional experience in terms of, running departments and how to get things done on campus and political climates on campus and how to deal with it. I have the benefit, I didn't have that information, that knowledge back then, and it still seems shady. I know it was shady.
We were very clear and articulate in pushing for very unique space that had its own identity to it. Not only architecturally, but not only with programming, and not only just with the community itself, but the way the space looked and felt. So we all had 4 different identities, and we wanted to keep that exactly as is. We didn't want to compromise that because, in the 1980s, we saw the language of multiculturalism co-opted, and it was whitewashed. We know that we saw that in the 21st century again, in academia and in higher ed, even corporate world, the corporatization of multiculturalism and diversity and inclusion, where they whitewash it to a degree that it doesn't mean it has no justice value anymore. It literally returns to the sort of food fund fiesta. And that's not what we intended to do. And my colleagues at the time and I were very, very, I think we were pretty radical at the time. We did not compromise on what we wanted to get accomplished. And the students, luckily for us, specifically La Casita, the students of La Casita, we shared a collective vision for what we wanted. And so I would not move without having the students as a central part of our decisions. Whether it was a conference, a program, our operational hours, because Juliet, you closed a lot. I remember you closed to 9 p.m. on these days, And so everything we did had to have a consensus because that's how our community has operated historically. So why would we let an institution change how we as a community operate? Ethnic studies has always been under attack. Whether it was an academic program, a student support services, or community organization, ethnic studies has always been under attack. So, it required the skill of leadership and community to make sure that we were strong enough to withhold these attacks. And, during my time when I was there, absolutely, there were conversations about a more multicultural space. We went back and forth a lot between us wanting to maintain our identity as directors of cultural spaces and also introducing this concept of us as assistant directors of a multicultural office. And, we had different leadership at the time that really wanted us to pronounce and articulate our multicultural identity more as professionals. But we knew that the way in which students, experienced their life was not as this sort of, multicultural, one big old melting pot of identities. And now granted, we do have a lot of students that are still coming into an understanding of who they are and their identities. But these cultural spaces were important and foundational and radical in helping students get to that space of understanding.
Black Affairs from the get-go did not want to have one building. Some ambassadors in the HLA were okay with it. Some other ambassadors in other areas, it wasn't really their fight because it's like they don't have that space. So they weren't invested in it. So the real core of the issue was between Black Affairs and HLA.
That was random. They didn't tell us that inspectors were coming or anything like that. They told us that we were excited to have 2 spaces. Like the first the first university in the country to have 2 spaces, whatever. And then that was random. Like one day they literally just said, well, the house is going to be condemned after this point. And then um, the design, they told us that we needed an assembly room, which was another weird thing that just came up. Like, we don't need that assembly room in the back of the 2 houses connecting them. I told them the houses are not reception halls. And they said, well, you need this is what you want. And I was like, no, it's not. Somebody else who I didn't even know, her name is Adebola Adedoyan. She went up to Mary Kay Carradine-Snyder after the town hall and started asking questions. Is it 1 house or 2 houses? And Mary Kay was giving different answers to different people. A lot of people crowded around her. And then from that, I kind of just left it. I put it out there, but I kind of left it. And then I saw this petition surface, and I turned out that Adebola had written a petition to keep the houses. It said save the IBC, and then in the content of it, it was like they should be separate houses, separate history, separate communities. There's overlap, but we're not going to be homogenized into one multicultural complex, so you all can check off that box. So she wrote a petition, and it went viral on campus again, and some alumni created a Facebook page called Revitalizing Our Roots. And they tried to hold visioning workshops, but they were poorly announced like the day before the workshop, and I could never attend them, or I was either too busy to attend them. But I was still watching from a distance, and then I ended up attending one of them in April of 2017, and there were like 6 students in the room, and the architects, I had heard rumors that they were combining the houses with a bridge between the houses because they needed an elevator to lift people to the 2nd floor, so it would be ADA compliant. So they were going to put an elevator in one house and then have a bridge on the 2nd floor for people to get across to the other house. And in my head, I was like, Chris, you got more common sense than this. They're not about to build a bridge between 2 houses. They're going to build one building. So I went to the vision, the whatever workshop, basically coded for, we're showing you the design that we want. And there were 6 students in the room. They showed a design that was one building. People started yelling, actually. Somebody was crying. Like, the room was, that meeting was intense.
And then again, within MCDA, yes, there were students who were okay with the one house model, and I respect that. But at the same time, I feel like there were more people, the majority of people wanted the 2 houses because of what they stood for and because of what they meant to the communities that actually use them. I really do think that the powers that be need to understand that not everybody fits into your categorization of a black student at UF or a Hispanic student at UF or a Latinx or LGBT student at UF. And that's why I don't know how widely this is known, but that's why under this current administration, the entire Asian Pacific Islander Affairs staff quit, just up and quit one day. They quit because they saw this issue is that y'all want us to behave a certain way and y'all want us to be this monolithic or homogeneous population in this homogeneous culture, but in reality, you can't force me to represent myself and my identity a certain way.
The overarching theory is that they wanted this one multicultural building, and that's why they would finesse or make up these numbers. That's why they would make up this argument for solidarity. So if you put all people of color in one building, that's solidarity, apparently. They called it that. They said it was a proverbial shaking of hands by having that little space connecting the IBC and La Casita. They came up with all these arguments in favor of their design, and we interpreted it as they want this design no matter what. Daniel Clayton he's a student who used to visit the IBC. He was very upset, and a few of it was like, you know what, we're gonna do something about this. So he started reaching out to people, and I was one of the people he messaged, and he was like, we should do something, like we should meet. And he said, bring people who you really, 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 really trust. And I handpicked a few people who I could trust, Mia and Steven and Ale. and Richard, and then we went to this meeting, and from there, No La Visita took off.
The fact that now the institute no longer is physically there, you're gonna need that. Again, somebody with that kind of vision, beyond the self, looking at the bigger picture, being able to unite people with different ideas and create a strategy that benefits just more than one group.
We got to do something. We can't just sit back. We're here as centers, as cultural awareness, because somebody advocated for us in the past, has put their line out there in the past. And for us not to continue that movement and continue to put the pressure on, we're not doing our job. We're not doing our job.
Let's give another round of applause. I think we owe many thanks to those who are collecting and organizing these histories. And I'm particularly grateful for students here at the University of Florida and across the country who've pushed for greater representation of people of color within higher education. I'm grateful because my position was probably produced in part because students have pushed for that, right, for those spaces. I am a professor in the Center for Latin American Studies and in the Department of Sociology of Criminology and Law, where I coordinate the Latinx Studies master's specialization in the center. But it's a unique space. At the center, I have 19 fantastic colleagues who focus specifically on different regions of Latin America. And there's one faculty, myself, whose scholarship is dedicated specifically to the context of better understanding Latinxes within the U.S., right? So I think we need, additional representation of folks doing that work, focusing on Latinx experiences here at UF. But I owe many thanks to those at UF and elsewhere who've pushed for, right, that representation. The successful push from students illustrates, I think, the efficacy of student organizing. And my comments are going to be a little brief and informal. I think we have a few more things to push for, right? Many more things to push for. One of them here at the University of Florida is additional resources for DACA students on campus, right? Many folks may not be aware that DACA students do not have access to student loans on our college campuses, right? They cannot get loans to attend college. They cannot get formal scholarships. There's no bright futures. There's no money, there are no resources, institutional resources that can be allocated to DACA students on campus. And I think that's another area that students have been pushing for, and I think we need to continue pushing for. We know that students organizing can be successful. We've seen the evidence of this here on our campus, of students pushing and recognizing that we need two separate spaces, right? And that can be effective, right? I think we continue to see success moving forward as we think about DACA students, their spaces, and resources for them. One other thing that I think is really important that we need to consider moving forward is that the University of Florida, within probably the next 5 to 7 years, will come to be designated a Hispanic serving institution. Right? We've talked a lot about this being a PWI, a white space, and it is a predominantly white institution. But HSI status is a federal designation of colleges across the United States, and it's allocated to those universities that have a 25% Latinx student undergraduate body. So if you have 25% undergraduate students, then you are then designated federally as a minority serving institution, right? A Hispanic serving institution. And you become eligible for some resources that are initially meant to help serve Latinx students in that capacity. That's going to happen not because the university has been actively seeking, right, to increase representation of Latinx students or others. That's going to happen because the demographics of our state are just transforming, right? So I think we need to think about what kind of minority serving institution the University of Florida will be. Right? Are we going to be a Latinx enrolling minority serving institution? Right? One that meets the quotas of the numbers, but perhaps is not enrolling black students? One that increasingly is enrolling Latinx students, but increasingly is enrolling fewer and fewer black students? And one that is perhaps not doing its best to serve either, What kind of minority-serving institution will we be? Those are things that we need to grapple with, and I'm encouraging students to consider these things because it's coming, right? That designation is coming, and I think it will permit many folks to say that our institution is diverse and inclusive because we are a Hispanic-serving institution, right? Without recognizing the interdynamics, right? And then, of course, what's also noteworthy is we have 8,000 Latinx students on our campus. That is many. We also don't have an undergraduate Latinx studies program, right? We have to be the largest. We have to have the largest share of Latinx students in the country without having an undergraduate Latinx studies program. Why is that? Are we going to be an HSI without a Latinx studies program? I don't know how you do that. All right, that's my soapbox. I think a lot about these issues. I've been studying issues related to Hispanic serving institutions. But really this session is an opportunity, I think, to appreciate the students, staff, and faculty who've advocated for Black and Latinx students at UF and to spotlight the students who've put in the work to document and share these histories. So I think I wanted to do a Q&A with some of the students, but I don't think we have the time. But let's just give another round of applause to all the students who are doing the excellent work of collecting these histories.
Very much, Nick. And what we're going to do now is I'm going to ask my colleague, Dr. Hazel Levy, to come to the front. And in the interest of time, we're going to try to stay on the agenda. It's amazing to have a program on a Friday afternoon to actually be on time, is it not? So we'll continue the dialogue and these questions that Professor Vargas raised, but we want to transition to Dr. Hazel Levy's presentation. And I think you have, we need to hook that up.
I think so. I'm going to try this. This looks familiar.
And while she is hooking up that presentation, and we may need some technical support, I'm not sure. Let me just run over the program for tomorrow. And so tomorrow we'll be at the Aquin Jones Center. Oh, okay, sorry. Okay, so tomorrow, oh, the mic isn't working actually.
Try this one.
So tomorrow morning at 9, we will meet at the Aquin Jones Center, which is at 1013 Northwest 7th Avenue. Now there is free parking there. Tomorrow we will not have to take a shuttle. And we will meet, we'll have light refreshments, coffee, so on and so forth. The theme of tomorrow is active commemorations, putting historical memory to work. Our first panel will start at 9:30 a.m. sharp. It will be our Ocoee, Florida panel, 100 Years of Accountability and Reconciliation. So that's going to be a superb event. You will not want to miss that. If you just joined us, you missed Albert White's wonderful reflections yesterday in Gator Tales. At 11:30 a.m., Albert will be making a presentation titled Legacies of Lincoln High School. Some of you have actually purchased his book. He and Kevin McCarthy wrote a wonderful book on the history of Lincoln High School in Gainesville. At 12:30 p.m., and this is an extra incentive to come to a symposium on a Saturday. To get people to come to something on Saturday, you have to give an incentive, right? And so we're actually having a catered lunch. We're inviting you to enjoy. And then we'll transition to our final panel, the Odyssey of Oscar Mack in Florida and beyond. And I think Julian Chambliss is here from Michigan State. Has he arrived? Yes. Let's welcome Julian. Who will join James Brand and Vanessa Bonner to talk about this incredible story, the Odyssey of Oscar Mack. And then we're going to have wonderful closing remarks from Professor Larry Rivers, who someone said having Professor Rivers giving the closing is unfair. It's like the Yankees bringing Mariano Rivera in the bottom of the ninth inning. You can't beat that, and so we're just grateful that he's here. And Dr. Hazel Levy, I will give you turn the podium over, but I want to provide a brief introduction. Dr. Levy has been an incredible scholar here at the University of Florida. She is a professor of biochemistry, cellular and molecular biology, and embryology at the University of Florida. She is the first African American woman to have a National Institutes of Health, NIH, funding laboratory at UF-Com. It's really an incredible accomplishment. In addition to researching cures for pediatric cancer and prioritizing the training of women of color in laboratory research practices, Dr. Levy directs an oral history project in collaboration with the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program's African American History Project, documenting the stories of the 13 black women faculty researchers that have been employed at UF-Com, which has just celebrated its 61st year of existence. So think about that. And we're just so grateful because, Dr. Levy, you bring, you've created opportunities for our students. You have helped to build the Joel Buchanan Archive. You know, this research, the documentaries that we've just seen, all become part of the Joel Buchanan African American Oral History Archive. And so please join me in welcoming Dr. Hazel Levy.
Thank you. I'm very humbled to be here. I'm not a historian at all. Can you see my slides with the lights up as they are? We don't want to shock you when you turn the lights back on later. But so I'll do my best. I'm not really used to talking about history or anything besides science in front of people, so just bear with me. But I want to first kind of acknowledge some of my mentors that are here. I have scientific mentors, Rob and Mavis McKenna, that are here. And I also have social justice mentors, Faye Williams, Zohara Simmons, Paul Ortiz here as well. And it's pretty special to have that happening at one time for me. So, yeah. So as Dr. Ortiz mentioned, my training is in biomedical research and specifically in virus structures, and I am going to talk a little science today because as your history sounds like blah, blah, blah to me sometimes, my science may sound like blah, blah, blah to you, but I guess I'm trying to make the point that black women pursuing their interests is still historic at the University of Florida, and so I'm going to take the time and do a little science chit-chat. So why is a research scientist interested in history? Coming into the university and knowing that I was a first of some sort, I knew I wasn't a first at all, right? And so I needed to kind of know the history behind the employment of black women at the College of Medicine so that I can understand how I'm posited in this history so that I can do a better job of being a scientist and being an educator, and so that I can put some of the experiences that I have and that my students have into historic context. I learned a term from Dr. Ortiz, history relevant, right? I think all our policies that we take on that are involved in inclusion and equity need to have a keen understanding of the truth of history. Another reason I'm interested in pursuing this oral history project is because I was actually in some ways discouraged from trying to excavate the employment data at the University of Florida. And you may or may not know this, but data over time takes on these different forms. And if you don't archive the data, if you don't update it into different forms, it can become lost. And so all the firsts that I don't know about can become invisibilized. And so I guess I want to challenge the university to think about putting funds and labor into archiving our employment history so that some of the firsts that we haven't recognized can be recognized. Another reason I do oral history is every morning when I go to work, I walk down the University of Florida College of Medicine's Founders Gallery. There's a wall of the past deans and scientists, and 100% of the beautifully painted portraits are of white men. And they're named, and they're these sweet portraits, and I guess I just wanted to make sure that we're naming the black women researchers as well. And there are other groups that need attention. I try to keep a laser focus on this group because when I do talk to the leadership where I'm employed about black women they often want to pivot the discussion to diversity in general. And so I think that there's a lot of projects that are addressing diversity in general. And so I think I like to keep a laser focus on Black women. So that's why. It's a long intro, sorry. So I don't know much about history. I don't know much biology. So I had to ask for help with this history project. And so two oral historians, Anupa and Holland, who's here today, did a lot of the work in actually collecting the oral histories from the women that we found. And so I just kind of want to put a shout out to them that it's important to have experts do the work. And so collaboration is key, okay? So together we looked at employment data, we conducted surveys, we created surveys trying to figure out what kind of information that we wanted to get, and then we gathered oral histories. And the point is that we wanted to name the Black women research faculty. We wanted to give them names for ourselves, for our institutions, and we wanted to highlight their scientific contributions as well as in the context of the work environments that they were performing in. And then we wanted to break the tradition of silence. In the College of Medicine, which is where I have most of my experience, there's not a lot of open dialogue about how Black scientists may have different experiences than their white colleagues. There's not a lot of discussion about non-binary genders and how that might influence your experience matriculating at the college, for example. And so I kind of wanted to just sort of just break that silence. I can honestly attest to the fact that there's silence because I've been affiliated with the University of Florida since 1990. I was a freshman in the dorms. I did my bachelor's, my master's, my PhD here. I've been a student, a faculty, a staff, a volunteer, a tutor. Gosh, I mean, there's probably other things, right? So I know that there's this culture of silence. I've been encouraged to keep it. So first step is sort of breaking this culture of silence, right, and elevating these narratives and these voices. I want to hear from the experts. I want to hear from the people that know what it's like to matriculate in these environments of isolation. I want them to tell me how their experiences are different. I don't want other people to tell us that our experiences are the same. So then I also want to normalize and formalize discussions. I think a next step, not just breaking the silence, but again, getting these narratives, getting discussions about our experiences around race and gender as we work and learn in different institutions, getting that discussion to be normal, and then maybe having some formalized ways of doing that as well. I think that that's needed. I don't think we stay at tier one forever and just deal with breaking silence. I think at some point we move to a second level of normalizing these discussions and not being afraid to make mistakes, do a bad job maybe. You know, I've not really had a lot of training in discussing diversity and inclusion, and so I have to do a bad job and then get corrected and then do better, okay? So part of normalizing it is acknowledging that we're going to make mistakes and that it might be awkward. And then as a big science nerd, I am very focused on data. And not facts. I don't really believe in facts. I think every data point that I've ever collected is not really right unless it comes with some margin of error, right? So I'm just interested in data, right? And so I want to know what the experts on working as marginalized members, what it's like, and I want to collate this information and create some analysis based on data so that we can have history-relevant inclusion initiatives. I want to see our initiatives that we do on campus be evaluated. I want to use metrics and data to say, this is what it was like before we put this diversity project into operation, or this inclusion or equity project into operation, and then I want to see the numbers afterward to see if we've done a good job or if we're putting our money in the right spot, or our labor, or our brightest people in the right places. I think that it's time to do that. There's a lot of fear around that. But as a scientist, I need some numbers. So, and And I want to do sort of a systems analysis. As my experience as a trainee of this university, there's been a lot of work that's been put into educating Black researchers and women researchers on how to be better scientists, right? Because it kind of focusing like maybe the reason our numbers aren't high enough is because we haven't been trained well enough in doing the science, writing the papers, writing the grants, and squeezing ourselves into an environment that we didn't really create. And so I'd like to take a step away from that. That's the model that I've been focused, that's been focused around me since I've been at this university, as I mentioned, or did I mention that I was a freshman in the dorms, 1990? Okay, let's move along. So I want to now have more discussions about the system. I want us to analyze the system based on individual experiences that we put together and say, what's up with the system? I no longer really want to be working to fix unbroken individuals that have tons of scientific experience, have tons of writing experience, are successful at getting grants, and so on. And then I also, as I mentioned, I want to evaluate this historic employment data and see what we can learn. I feel like certain initiatives have come and gone. We've had different leaders come and go. And it would be very nice to see where the blips and bumps and where good things happen or, based on what we want to happen. First, we have to agree on what our goals are, right? But maybe we can look at the history of our employment records at the University of Florida and see where things have gone well and where things have gone backwards. So those are my goals. Some of the information that we've learned by asking questions and talking to the experts and looking at the public record around employment. So all this employment data is public record. Nothing is secret or private or anything. This is a public institution, right? But even that public record is going to become invisible if we don't find ways of archiving it, okay? So in this 63 years, I think I wrote that statement, Paul, 2 years ago. I apologize, but I think the University of Florida College of Medicine is now 63 years old, okay? And there's been 36 total full-time Black women faculty. And 13 of them have had a research assignment like I have. I'm not a physician. I do research in the lab. And so the rest have been clinical faculty, meaning that they are doctors and they see patients and so on. Of those 13 researchers, 3 have been independent. And I put in red independent because I realized that was jargon. I put it in there and I was like, independent, everybody knows what that means. But independent means that you are deciding what your projects are, you are deciding who your workers are, you have space and funds to do the work. So that's what an independent researcher is. And so 3 of them have had, 3 of us have had that. Others have executed other people's projects for the most part in other people's lab spaces. In some cases, people have had funds. They've had external NIH funds, but still haven't had their own independent lab space. So the record has different sets of this, okay? So a little bit of the history, I kind of did it by tens, but like from 1956 to 1992, there were 0 Black women faculty at the College of Medicine. And then from 1992 to 2000, 5 joined. And as I mentioned, this is when I was a student at the University of Florida. So when I first came in 1990, there hadn't been any Black women faculty hired, full-time faculty hired to the University of Florida College of Medicine. So 5 joined between 1992 and 2000, 11 joined from 2000 to 2009, and then 21 joined from 2010 to 2017. So we see an upward trend in the number of Black women that are employed full-time at the College of Medicine. And I add these percentages, these retention rates, so as we add faculty, we lose them as well. And I think that's really important to look at retention rates and how long people stay and how many come and go, and compare that with other groups to see what we can do about that and see if we can follow those metrics. Yeah. So 7 were non-clinical faculty on the research track, and 1 has been tenured, and that Mavis McKenna is here today. And was the first African-American, or excuse me, black woman researcher to have her own independent research lab, as well as to the only, at this point, to have tenure. So we have 1 tenured professor that's a black woman at the UF College of Medicine. So I think that's worth noting. What an accomplishment, and I'll tell you more about her accomplishments in a moment. So 4 total have been hired to the tenure track, and another one of the women whose research I'm going to highlight, she's a newer hire to the tenure track. Okay, so I wanted to point out that right now there are 4 research track faculty that are black women at the University of Florida College of Medicine, 4, and 3 of them are either Dr. McKenna or her trainees. So 75% of us are from a single lab. I think that that's worth noting that, to me, even though our numbers are small, there's concrete data on how these pipelines are created. So some of my conclusions from looking at the oral histories and from poring over the employment data from the public record, that retention rates are an important metric, that hiring rates should not be overemphasized if we don't recruit faculty to an environment where they can thrive. Resources, salary, benefits, startup packages, lab space, formalized mentorship. I think we should analyze these things across the different racial groups in order to come up with good faith inclusion and equity programs to see how there may be differences for different groups. So another thing we've found is that black women individuals are competitive researchers that achieve at the highest levels in the current merit system. And I want to point out that the current merit system, how tenure and promotion are decided, all of that was created before there were black women faculty at the University of Florida College of Medicine. So I think it's important to kind of look at the history of how merit systems are created and by who, and maybe think that we need to reevaluate merit systems because as I'm kind of representing right here, a lot of the work that we do, a lot of the labor that we do for the University of Florida is racial and gender-based labor. But many of those labors are not recognized in our merit criteria and are not part of our pay. They're not valuated. And so I think it's important to kind of note that black women researchers are competitive at the highest levels while also doing this kind of basket of underappreciated labor that has value to the university. Black women faculty are particularly successful at creating pipelines for new black women researchers, and that women from various, as well as women from various racial and ethnic groups, as well as interested students and researchers in general. And I wanted to point out that black women, young scientists, they find us. I don't ever put out a sign that said, hey, looking for specifically black women researchers to come train in my lab. I've never even said that I'm looking for that, but yet people find you. Okay, so I think it's important to kind of note that students are smart. And then back to this data bit, because there is a website from our Office of Institutional Research. I can never get it right because they changed their name, that's why. And where you can look at the different demographic groups at the university. You can click on full-time faculty, part-time faculty. You can click on, there's only men and women that you can choose from, although they note that I think that they are working on having non-binary gender options because it's all self-identity. You can pick race. Your level of employment is there, whether you're a tenure track or clinical track or what have you, or whether you're a student or postdoc. So there's a lot of this public data that is available on the University of Florida's website, but that data is only over a 10-year range, and our university has been around a lot longer than that, so it's hard to do an entire historic look. And also the way that they report the data is confusing. It somehow does like what's called a head count, which kind of considers not just an individual, but how long they've been there. So it's not like you're really looking at the number of people that are there at a period of time. So I just wanted to point that out, that's another reason why I wanted to do my own analysis so that I could have the data in front of me and figure out what I was looking at. Okay, so let's move on to the three women that have independent research programs at the University of Florida. And Mavis McKenna in biochemistry joined the faculty in 1993. Christiana Fredenberg in pathology joined the faculty in 2016. And I am in pediatrics, and I joined in 2014. And there's about 300 faculty that have lab spaces all together at the College of Medicine, and we are the three black women. So yeah, and I mean, in a snapshot, that 1%, it's not as shocking as when you look at the history. Okay, but I think we're making that point, right? So Dr. McKenna, who I just owe so much to, particularly my interest and love for the details, meaning the atomic details. She's the director for the Center of Structural Biology at the College of Medicine, and she's a professor of biochemistry and molecular biology, and she has amazing patents and all kinds of scientific achievements, but one of the most important ones, I think, is that she has done a tremendous job of mentoring to students, and that she has mentored, as I mentioned, two of the black women who are current research faculty at the U of me and another researcher. And she's mentored three black women through their PhDs, and she currently has another black woman in her lab that is working toward her PhD. She has mentored 14 women total through their PhDs, and 19 graduate students in general through their PhDs. And over 75 undergraduates mentored. Mavis, that's wild to me. It's wild. Yeah, just 75. Which if you add that up, that's like 100 trainees. And that doesn't even count the ones that decided to make a change and aren't counted here as having graduated, right? So let's talk a little science. Don't be afraid. You could take a nap. Don't worry about it. That's what my students do. They're like, okay. But so Mavis studies viruses, and one of her subjects is the adeno-associated virus, and it's a special virus because it's studied and used in the clinics as a gene therapy delivery system. And what that means is you may have a sickness that has a defective gene, and you could replace that gene with a healthy one by delivering it through these nanoparticles that are also viruses. And so essentially these little particles, they're tiny, and they have a capsid shell, which is this outer piece that's made out of proteins, and inside they have this gene, this therapeutic gene that has been engineered. So it's not the normal virus's genome that's shown here, the genes. We change it and put the things we want in there, the things that we think will make you not sick. Okay, and so that's what I'm kind of showing here on the one side, that kind of hexagonal structure, that's the outer protein shell, and on the right, is that your right? Yes. That's kind of the structure of the DNA. And below, in this square, this is what these particles look like by electron microscopy. And so Mavis uses electron microscopy and X-ray crystallography to look at these viruses as closely as you can. I mean, I actually spent my head in AAV for the last couple of days looking at all of the atoms that are in there making up this outer protein shell. It's funner than it sounds. Like, how's she doing that? So quickly, I just want to say that these viruses have what are called life cycles. And this picture that I've drawn, not so well, my brother's a great artist, I'm okay. There's a barrier that's supposed to be the outside of the cell, which is the white piece, and then the gray is supposed to be the inside of the cell. And then deeper inside the cell, that little oval, white oval, is the nucleus. That sounds familiar, right? Outside the cell, inside the cell nucleus, great. And so the virus has to approach the cell, get the cell to let it go inside, and then find its way to places where it can operate. The virus can't operate everywhere. And so it uses this outer shell, this protein, to get it to where it needs to go, all right? And so we study, and I learned this in Mavis's lab, the structure and how the structure of this virus determines how it perpetuates its life cycle. One of the problems with AAV, with using a virus as a therapy, is that we have immunity to some of these viruses and parts of the virus. And I just wanted to show one of Mavis's very important and recent papers. I don't have a pointer, do I? Oh well. So I'll just walk over. So here's this image. A is a picture of the virus. And she has bound different antibodies to the virus and kind of put them. So in red, yellow, and blue, we're showing the virus covered with some of these antibodies. And then furthermore, they've pinpointed where on the capsid, which amino acids actually interact. That's not me. That's not my phone. That's not. No way. Okay. And so in order to avoid, you don't want your immune system to take your therapies away. And so in order to keep the immune system from taking your therapy away, they have engineered the virus to have mutations or changes in these areas where these antibodies bind in order to try to create a vector or a therapy that will avoid the immune system to deliver the therapy. That wasn't that bad. Oh. See? Science. Okay, Dr. Fredenberg, she's MD and a PhD, and she does clinical work as well as run a research lab. She's in the pathology department, and she does a lot of mentoring as well. So she's on the diversity committee, which at the College of Medicine, which is involved in recruitment of College of Medicine students, and she's in this Diversity Inclusion Working Group, which is actually an invited group, and she has 5 mentees in her lab right now, 2 African American women and 3 white women. And she has a current project where she works on disparities, looking at like the biological basis of outcomes for head and neck cancer, and looking at the cells that are found in the head and neck cancers in Black Americans versus the cells that are found in head and neck cancers of white Americans, and looking to see how the genes are functioning differently, to see if she can find some nuanced change. So this picture is, I just want to show this kind of cutting edge work that Dr. Fredenberg is working on. She's working with what's called CAR T cells, okay, and it's a way of engineering, it's a patient's own cells, their own immune system cells, to attack cancer. Okay, and so you basically take some particle that you believe the cancer cells are expressing, and you take out the patient's own T cells, and you culture their T cells to where the cells will target that cancer. So T cells are cells that you have in your immune system that actually help to get rid of viruses, help to get rid of cancerous cells and other things that are considered to be invaders, right? And so they basically train your immune system cells to find and attack your own cancer. Then after they work with these cells, they put them back in the patient, and they've had quite a lot of success. And many different research groups are working with CAR T cells, and Fredenberg is collaborating with the group that's looking at cancers specifically of the head and neck region. And so I'm a research assistant professor in pediatrics. I'm affiliated in the biochem department as well as in the African American Studies department. That's strange, but she did that. She did that. And I'm a faculty advisor to the burgeoning Black Women in Medicine Student Association. I think I have one representative here today. Who I just met with them today, and boy, they're smart. And I'm also on the diversity committee with Dr. Fredenberg, and I'm a recipient of the National Institutes of Health Independent Research Scholar Award to promote workplace diversity. And I've mentored 2 Asian women and 2 Black women in my lab. And we work on medullary thyroid carcinoma, as well as I do this oral history project. And so medullary thyroid carcinoma is a type of thyroid cancer, and I work to try to engineer adeno-associated viruses, those viruses that Mavis works on. I try to engineer them to kill cancer cells. And so this picture on the left with the graph is basically showing that this virus that we've engineered prefers to get into the TT cells, which is our model for medullary thyroid carcinoma, than it then it prefers to get into other cells, and that's what we want. We want to target our therapy to our cancer cells. And on the right side, I have a tumor model where I'm actually able to take these human cells and grow them into a tumor, and then I inject them with my vector. And if you look on the bottom, this green piece, wherever we have green, my vector's gotten in and is expressing the gene that I put in there. And so we are able to get our vector to express genes inside these cancer cells and to prefer these cancer cells over other cell types. And that's it. That's the talk. A little history, a little science.
Very good.
Thank you. So proud of you. I love you, Faye. Yes.
Are you on a tenure?
No.
Ernie? Is there a possibility for you to be on a tenure?
You put me on the spot, kind of.
Oh, good.
Because I don't know if that's what I want.
Okay.
I don't know if that's an opportunity for me, but I also don't know if I'm interested in that. I have issues in general with the tenure system. That's what I was talking about, the merit criteria and how that's all allocated and analyzed. I don't think it's really considered women. I don't think it's really considered other racial and ethnic groups, and so I'm not that interested in being judged by it.
Okay.
Anybody else?
So,
Terry.
in terms of your thyroid research, do you, is it like an active, is there human clinical trials yet? Or are you getting halfway?
What I need to do now, so I turned the cancer green. That's not going to cure anyone, right? Now I need to kill the cancer cells. I need to take that green gene out and put in something that'll kill these cancer cells, and that's our next step, is to just basically re-engineer these particles and then test them again and see if we can't reduce the size of the tumor. I'm also, there are current therapies for these tumor types. There are kinase inhibitors, and they cause a lot of awful side effects for people. People have even died from the side effects. And so I'm also interested in seeing if I can use my vector to sort of help to reduce the amount of other therapies you have to use to try to treat and maybe cure.
Can you use the mic?
Okay. Well, we were having mic trouble, and this one's stuck, and I want to walk around, Faye. Yes.
You mentioned meeting earlier with your group, Black Women in Research.
Yes.
Is that students or professionals? And
Students.
How many are in the?
They're just starting, but there's 4 or 5 of them that I've been meeting with, and they are just becoming a brand new student association. I think they're going to be very successful. Yes?
I have 2 questions. Do we know anybody who might want to join that? Where can we get information on that? Not because I'm not saying, but like I have friends who are like nursing and like obviously like African American.
And want to be a part of that club.
Possibly like just
Yes.
it's also good like to have support system of people in your field who understand your struggle.
Agreed. Oh, it's been really amazing already. They participate in other groups. We come back and talk about what their experiences were like and what is asked of them and when they're asked to be quiet and when they're asked to be loud. And we talk together about what's a good strategy going back, how to do better next time. It's been amazing already. And the more the merrier. And so I think they are part of the students' organization, whatever.
Yeah, so they'd be like on SAI. Like
Yeah, that.
And then my second question was, out of all the cancers, why specifically like the thyroid? Like hypothyroidism runs in my family.
Why thyroid cancer?
Specifically.
This is why. It's not going to be a very satisfying answer. It's because that particular cancer, there's not a cure, so that's important. But also, they express the calcitonin gene, and they do it more than other cells altogether. And so the chair of my department, Scott Rifkes, and Jackie Hobbs, they got together and collaborated on this idea that if we can use some of the information from that calcitonin gene, maybe we can get a therapy to only express